Lyndon LaRouche, from 1966 to 2019, was a dominant intellectual force in world thought, and the Schiller Institute is engaged in a project to republish his collected works, which are very extensive. The following presentation, which was originally produced in June 2019, shortly after his passing, will give you an idea of the reason for that project and the relationship of that project to the international strategic situation that we face today.
Hello to all of you. Many of you have participated in the outstanding memorial for my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, or you have viewed the video in the meantime. And then you got a taste of what a beautiful mind my husband really had and how important the ideas are for the world today. As a matter of fact, I would put him on the same level of thinkers, those thinkers who maybe only have one per century and who change through their intellectual contribution the entire body of knowledge of their time and lay the foundation for future generations to come. So I put him on the same level like Plato, Nicolaus of Cues, Kepler, Leibniz, Einstein, because he contributed to all of the works of these great thinkers something unique, the LaRouche method of thinking.
So what is action? What is relevant action? What kind of actions can we take which the universe acknowledges to be a command? Well, typical of those kinds of acts that we make, which we can prove the universe will obey. Otherwise, the universe won't obey them, are actions which conform to the discovery of a universal physical principle. If you can discover a validated universal physical principle, and you can give that as an order to the universe will obey. Man is the only creature that can do that. They can formulate an order called a universal physical principle, validate that discovery, and issue that discovery as an order, a command to the universe, and the universe is compelled to obey. That is the means, the accumulation of these principles, which we are part of our technological culture, is the means by which mankind has been able to increase the life expectancy, to improve the demographic characteristics of populations, and in general to increase man's power, measurable power, in and over the universe per capita and per square kilometer. That's the great scientific experiment. We are able to do this not only through physical experiments, through physical discovery. We're able to do this by discovering higher levels of methods of social cooperation through which we're able to cooperate in fostering these kinds of discoveries and applying them. Okay? So those things, those are the kinds of actions which the universe acknowledges to be man's willful actions of significance. Everything else that man does is on the level that any lower form of animal life can accomplish. So therefore, the kinds of action which distinguish a human being from lower forms of animal life is that, and only that. Now look at this question of strategy, which I've introduced here, from that standpoint. Strategy should mean, once we've understood these lessons, which presumably we had learned from study of European history since the time of Solon and Plato, say, what's important? What is strategy? The purpose of strategy is to defend the human species, to improve its condition, to improve its well-being, to improve its power in and over the universe at large. That's the purpose of strategy. In order to do that, we must promote scientific discovery and utilize it. We must promote those discoveries of principles, such as artistic principles, which enable us to cooperate in more advanced ways, to utilize these physical discoveries for man's benefit. What we therefore require is forms of society in which we perpetuate the rearing of our children and our institutions in such a way that this mission of mankind, implicit in our nature, is fulfilled. Thus, we fight to defend this idea of progress. We fight to defend and improve forms of society which promote progress. We fight to undermine and nullify those forms of culture and political and social systems which are the enemies of progress. The significance of the United States is that it was produced as a product of a certain phase in European civilization, coinciding with the 15th century Renaissance centered in Italy. It struggled to create a form of society in which the only legitimate authority awarded to government was the responsibility and power to promote the general welfare of each and all persons. That is, to promote progress in that sense. In this process, during that century, the policy was adopted of having self-governing, modern, sovereign nation-states whose authority to rule was located in the commitment to progress so defined.
And I'm absolutely convinced that if we would publish right now his collected works, which is a gigantic task because he was one of the most prolific writers of his time, it would have the same effect like the introduction of Plato to the Italian Renaissance. Now let me explain to you what I mean by that. The Italian Renaissance was prepared by many factors, by the work of Dante, Petrarca, many sculptors and great painters. But what really caused the spark to really make the Renaissance what it became was the introduction of Plato and the thinking of Nicolaus of Cues. Nicolaus of Cues belonged to a circle of humanist thinkers who believed that you had to go back to the original documents of all times, of all events and handwritings. So in this capacity, he was sent by the Pope to find out if the filioque question was in the early documents of the early councils of the Church. Now, the filioque was the question which had separated the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. It was the question, does the Logos emanate only from the Father, which was the belief in the Orthodox Church, or does it also emanate from the Son, filioque? Now, Nicolaus went to Byzantium, and he did find all the handwritings of the early councils of the Church, which did contain the filioque. Now, this was a complete breakthrough, because that meant that he could convince the fathers of the Orthodox Church to come to the councils of Ferrara and Florence. So in 1437-38, he came with a whole delegation of about 700 people, the Emperor of Byzantine, the Patriarch, and many scholars. He traveled from Greece to these councils. And already on the way, because he talked to people like Georgis Gemistos Plethon, who was the 83-year-old advisor of the emperor, and he was the top scholar of Plato in Greece, He actually wanted to introduce, Plato to have a renaissance in Greece. And he was, refuting Aristotle. He thought that Aristotle had absolutely misrepresented Plato's ideas, or he was not capable of understanding them. He said Aristotle is completely incompatible with Christianity. So the dialogue between Nikolaus and all of these scholars meant that Nikolaus had a breakthrough already on that trip. He came to develop a method of thinking where he was very self-conscious about, and he said, I'm now saying something which no human being has ever thought before. And that was the principle of the coincidentia oppositorum. This is the idea that the one has a higher value and a higher magnitude than the many, and that the human mind can always overcome contradictions by developing a level of reason on a higher plane, which gives you a way to solve problems which were not solvable on the lower plane. And that idea indeed was a complete breakthrough of thinking, because Aristotle had said, well, you cannot have something being true and being the opposite of something not being true. And all these thinkers, including Nikolaus, said this is a completely low level of thinking because you remain on the plane of contradictions, while Nikolaus then in the Apologia Docte Ignorantia, which was his rebuttal of a scholastic professor from Heidelberg, Johannes Wenck, he said, Aristotle is really, very low level of thinking, like the ratio of an animal, but no better. While the method Plato developed, and which I now developed further, is like the creative thinking being self-conscious about itself. It's like standing on a high tower, and from that vision point, you can see the searcher, that which is being searched, and the process of searching. And that gives you a completely different approach. Now, this delegation arrived in Ferrara, and there were many lectures hosted by Cesarini, whom Cusanus had devoted his Docta Ignorantia to. And all these scholars then listened to Plethon and Bessarion, who was the Archbishop of Nicaea, and they were introduced for the first time to the entire works of Plato, which in the rest of Europe, other than Greece, had been completely lost after the fall of ancient Greece after the Peloponnesian War. There were a few copies in some monasteries, but nobody could read Greece. And when Petrarca tried to learn Greece, he couldn't find anybody who would teach him. So he never was able to access this. But he knew that this guy Plato had to be extremely important, because Augustinus in his writings referred to it. So these lectures sparked an incredible intellectual ferment. And fortunately, among the listeners was somebody from a very wealthy family, namely Cosimo de' Medici, and he financed a crash program of the translation of the works of Plato. So the combination of Cusanus' writings and the emergence of the entire works of Plato laid the foundation for the paradigm shift which separated the Middle Ages from the modern times. The Middle Ages being characterized by scholasticism, Aristotelianism, belief in witchcraft, superstition, and then the new ideas, the new paradigm, a new image of man emerged, and a completely new conception that there was the possibility of infinite perfectibility of each human being, that science and technology could study the laws of the universe, and that this would be the basis for the improvement of the living standard, an increased population. So it was a complete revolution, and it laid the foundation for everything good coming out of European history for the following 600 years to come. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that the publication of the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche would have a similar, maybe even more powerful effect today. Because what do you have today? You have in the West a complete cultural crisis. You have a collapse of moral values. You have the sciences dominated by utilitarianism and the idea of profit. Many scientists are just bread scholars. They work for their salary, but they are not trying to find truth. This is a known phenomena among all the faculties around the world. If you get enough money, you publish whatever you are told to publish. Now, the cultural collapse of the West is obvious to everybody. The drug epidemics, the terrible youth culture, the ugliness in the so-called arts, and many more such phenomena. So I'm absolutely convinced that if we would publish now as quickly as possible the collected works of Lynn, it would spark an incredible excitement, because the ferment already exists, because while the West is in a dark age, that is not the case for all of the world, because the new Silk Road, sponsored and originated by China, that spirit, the spirit of the new Silk Road, has already caught on in about 126 countries which have joined the Belt and Road Initiative and who have the idea that there will be, a completely new time where poverty and underdevelopment can be overcome.
If you're just joining us, we want to welcome you to panel 1 of the 2-day Schiller Institute Conference, The World After the United States Election, Creating a World Based on Reason. Panel 1 has been entitled Hang Together or Hang Separately, Free and Sovereign Republics or Digital Dictatorship. An international investigative commission on truth in elections was formed 2 weeks ago, and 2 representatives of that commission will now present the results of their inquiry into the American presidential election of 2020. They are Marino Elsaviv of the Dominican Republic, an attorney at law and member of the 1995 Martin Luther King International Tribunal. The second is David Meiswinkle, United States attorney at law, and he will give the second report.
Mi nombre es Marino Elsaviv Pineda, abogado de la República Dominicana.
My name is Marino Elsaviv Pineda, a lawyer from the Dominican Republic. I'm a member of the International Investigative Commission of the Schiller Institute, who had the honor of participating in hearings on the electoral crisis that the American people are going through at this time. I was joined by Simon Levy from Mexico, Juan Francisco Soto from Argentina, and David Meiswinkle from New Jersey, a lawyer from the United States. We are all lawyers. And on that basis, we heard from witnesses: William Binney, Harley Schlanger, retired Colonel Richard Black, State Senator Mario Scavello, Benny Smith, a computer expert, and Leah Hoops, who also testified before the commission, which met on Saturday, November 28th, 2020, in a virtual meeting to hear about the crisis that American democracy is going through.
Antes de referirme a los detalles de la conferencia virtual del 28 de noviembre,
before mentioning the details of that virtual conference on November 28th, I must refer to the paradox of the elections in the United States and to the destruction of the American nation-state. There has clearly been a practice in U.S. elections going back at least 20 years to use fraud to a greater or lesser degree, including in the internal and primary campaigns of the political parties, as was the case
Le ocurrió a Lyndon LaRouche dentro del Partido Demócrata,
with what always happened to Lyndon LaRouche in the Democratic Party, which he denounced clearly and precisely, saying that the Democratic Party was acting like a private club and was habitually carrying out this mischief, these frauds. But, returning to the Commission, let me state the following about a number of the statements that we heard in the virtual conference of November 28th, 2020. Let me say that we heard testimony about the alteration of the Smartmatic and Dominion voting machines and software. In other words, these voting systems were altered for the specific purpose of undermining the candidacy of President Donald Trump.
Estas irregularidades que han sido testimoniadas en la comisión,
these irregularities that were reported to the Commission fundamentally involve a really dangerous situation regarding the violation of electoral voting in the United States, such that the states must confirm where, in each of the polling stations or vote centers, these criminal events occurred which violate the will of the people and at the same time distort the vote to the benefit of one party in a manner contrary to the free will of the American voter. What we're dealing with, therefore, is an electoral crisis that is intimately linked to the health crisis and the economic crisis, which is perhaps the greatest economic crisis since the 1929 crash, the Great Depression, and its aftermath, the Second World War.
existe realmente una duda razonable en estas elecciones.
There really is a reasonable doubt about these elections, and it is up to the Federal Electoral Commission and other U.S. authorities to intervene to determine in each of the states where there are reports of voting irregularities, to determine if American citizens' votes have been conjured up, co-opted, diverted, or violated according to the complaints that we have heard in this commission of the Schiller Institute, which I am honored to have participated in.
Finalmente, quería referirme a un artículo de Lyndon LaRouche escrito hace 20 años sobre el destino manifiesto.
Finally, I want to refer to an article by Lyndon LaRouche, written 20 years ago, on Manifest Destiny. The United States of America were the creators of the sovereign nation state dedicated to the common good of its citizens. And back then, They waged a war to break their ties to the British Empire, and above all, they cast off being subjects of the British Crown as a result of those circumstances and the ideas of Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, John Quincy Adams. In short, of all those great Americans who believed in the American dream, in the sovereign nation-state, and in agape, they believed that knowledge is what creates new technologies and new conditions for human beings to live for the common good.
En ese ámbito, ese manifiesto del que hablaba Lyndon LaRouche hoy se traduce en esta crisis.
In that regard, that manifesto, which Lyndon LaRouche spoke of, translates today in this crisis, a crisis which clearly requires a principle, the principle of reason. And those solutions must be based on a new nation-state protected with the ideas of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, based on the central idea that nation-states that respect their identities can avert the current crisis.
Pueden conjurar la crisis actual y no podemos volver a una nueva situación de fascismo.
We cannot return to a new situation of fascism, to a new dark age, to the darkness of the Middle Ages, and to a situation where the Venetian banking houses of yesteryear, which today are those of Wall Street and the City of London, become the owners of mankind's goods and services to benefit the few and to the detriment of the great majority.
El surgimiento de un nuevo renacimiento en el siglo XV.
The emergence of a new renaissance today, like that of the 15th century, is once again an imperative for the American people, and also for all the peoples of Latin America. We are concerned about the threat to democracy, and above all, we are concerned about the great danger of falling into a new age of fascism, a new dark age for all humanity, if American democracy fails.
Greetings. My name is David Meiswinkle, attorney at law practicing in the state of New Jersey. Free and fair elections, a hallmark of a democratic society, appears to have disappeared in the United States of America this past November 3rd. 2 weeks ago, I had the honor to participate on the International Investigative Commission for Truth in Elections, sponsored by the Schiller Institute, and to be part of a panel of legal experts consisting of Marina Elzef from the Dominican Republic, Simon Levy from Mexico, and Juan Francisco Soto from Argentina. We heard testimony of witnesses concerning evidence of massive voter fraud connected to the 2020 general elections, especially involving various close races in swing states. Witnesses include former NSA technical director and whistleblower William Binney, former state senator Colonel Richard Black, voting machine and algorithm programs expert Benny Smith, Pennsylvania State Senator Mario Scavello, Republican poll worker Leah Hoops, and Schiller Institute spokesman Harley Schlanger. The witness testimony appeared to be consistent, sincere, and credible. The infractions testified to included but were not limited to suspicion of problems with certain voting machines and software. In specific, these voting machines have been outlawed in some advanced countries because of their alleged capability for manipulating elections by the switching of votes. The witnesses also alleged massive mail-in ballot fraud. The witnesses reported expressions of outright hostility to Republican challengers, including preventing some of them from observing the ballot, counting, and recording of votes. There were discussions of ballots not being counted, of scanners not working, of mysterious malfunctions preceding massive vote tally changes. Witnesses asserted that there was unfair and one-sided coverage by the mainstream news media and by the social networking platforms Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Witnesses stated they believed there were biased coverage, often vociferously differently hostile to the president and supportive of his challenger throughout the election campaign, and that this atmosphere of hostility prejudiced the reporting of improprieties in the election process, even including challenging the integrity of citizens who had filed affidavits as documents with legally binding consequences to indicate the validity of their charges. This election controversy occurs in the midst of a national lockdown process caused by the COVID-19 virus. There are disagreements about how to respond and even what the nature of the medical threat is, which have been alleged by some to have been taken advantage of to argue for alternative voting procedures and changes in election practices that may in fact have not been necessary at all. The effect of the virus on especially middle America, small businesses, working people, and the poor set the stage for an unprecedented mail-in ballot process which appeared to the witnesses to be part of a design to steal an election. This forced an unprecedented and unsupervised mail-in tsunami of ballots. This appears to have affected the number of ballots in large cities such as Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Atlanta. Some years ago, I was hired as an attorney to investigate allegations of voting fraud by a client in a primary election involving absentee ballots. By pulling the voter registration signatures and comparing them with the signatures on the mail-in envelopes, it appeared to be fraud. A handwriting expert from New York City was hired, and he confirmed what both the client and myself suspected. We went into court, subpoenaing all the voters of the suspected ballots, calling them to the stand and questioning them. Their votes were eliminated one by one until the judge overturned the election and declared my client the primary victor. During election campaigns in New Jersey, in which I was personally the candidate, there was so much cheating going on in the New Jersey Democratic stronghold that it was necessary to call into the city on 3 separate elections the Attorney General's office. After one election, voting machines were impounded for inspection, and 2 separate federal lawsuits were filed after the other elections. So I have seen on a microscopic level corrupt elections and can attest to the illegalities and nastiness that is associated with the machine town where one party is overwhelmingly in control of the voting machines, the voting buildings, and its immediate area. And now apparently we see abhorrent voting fraud actions throughout the country in a presidential election. The hearing officers of our commission concluded after the witness testimony 2 weeks ago on the 2020 general election that 1. Serious irregularities appeared to exist that were legitimate legal and civil questions regarding the violation of both federal and state election law. 2. Voter fraud must be specified and validly supported with evidence. 3, there is a need for a determination by the courts as to whether the cheating was so significant and appreciable as to have altered and impacted the election. 4, each state should call committees to assure standards for validating votes. 5, there is a need for a federal criminal investigation into the possibility of conspiracy to undermine the presidential election of 2020, both domestic and foreign. My personal assessment: what's at stake with the fraudulent election? Everything. A line has been drawn. The parasitic and treasonous orchestrators, normally camouflaged in plain view, are being exposed through their own overt actions, their fake news. There is a momentous pushback by people not previously moved. The stirring of patriotic and the revolutionary fervor is beginning to surface throughout the country. A great awakening has begun. Both individual and national sovereignty is in the balance. American foundations and roots are being drawn upon. The Constitution and Bill of Rights shall stand. The heritage of our forefathers call. The battle has begun.
We now broaden our look at the U.S. presidential elections of the last 5 years, 2016 and 2020. Now, the most controversial aspect of that process is the so-called Russiagate hacking of the Democratic National Committee of 2016, an incident that led to 21 states changing various elements of their electoral procedures and equipment. Julian Assange and his case is notorious, both because of his persecution and because of its implications for the rest of us. It's intimately tied with the United States elections of 2016 and 2020. Were the President of the United States to act in this case, it would be both a humanitarian and legal revelation. Our next speaker is Victor Dedage, citizen journalist, and the presentation is entitled The Crucifixion of Julian Assange, a journalist committed to truth and peace.
Hello to everybody. My name is Victor Dedage. I am a citizen journalist who has adopted this mission for 30 years now after discovering Latin America and following politics in Latin America. I've been following the past and present evolution and revolutions in Latin America, especially Nicaragua, later Cuba. It was therefore natural that I was very interested in all notions of knowledge, freedom of the press, and how to circulate propaganda. When WikiLeaks appeared on the international scene in 2010, it appeared only natural that we should meet somewhere. And this experience of WikiLeaks, for us alternative media, alternative journalists, was literally a kind of hope. A hope to get rid of having to depend on the information conveyed by the mainstream media, which we were certainly scrutinizing and analyzing. Now, a new media offered us raw and unfiltered information. The WikiLeaks model was crucial for us. The model was the following. It offered to whistleblowers the ability to anonymously post authentic documents issued by insiders within the entities of corrupt systems, without the risk of retaliation or punishment. In addition, WikiLeaks and its team of journalists and technicians guaranteed the authenticity of these documents. And the third thing WikiLeaks was morally committed to was that someone somewhere had taken risks to expose crimes or embezzlement. This model was therefore something quite extraordinary, quite innovative. Similar websites existed, but they lacked the dimension and the validity of the data, the certification of the authenticity of the documents. You are aware of the 2010 publication of the famous video Collateral Murder, which I considered a sort of trailer WikiLeaks prepared to introduce a whole series of other documents, terrible documents, about the reality of the wars that were hidden from us. We were there with the WikiLeaks phenomenon at the heart of a major problem that appeared in the post-9/11 world. This world, the turning point after the attacks, is distinguished by several factors. The first is the state of astonishment in which the world found itself under the threat of an American empire that was unleashed with words like, "You're either with us or against us." A second element, post-9/11, is the explosion of the security and intelligence services in terms of volume and margins for maneuvering. The tentacles of these entities were spreading. They were becoming more and more invasive and less controlled. Governments, under the pretext of fighting terrorism, a phenomenon, arrogated to themselves the right to practice more and more in the dark and less in transparency. And as for the media, and this is the essential point, they abandoned any claim of objectivity, and we saw the emergence of what has been called embedded journalism. The big international media did not even pretend to do their job. So it was logical that a media like WikiLeaks, which we could call Media 2.0, emerged soon after these phenomena. It was essential for democracy that our right to know as citizens be restored. And this right to know, which was sacred to WikiLeaks, was probably the greatest service it could render to humanity at that moment in the midst of those events. If you think about it, you became aware of it, and I think the public didn't realize it immediately, but some people got the point very quickly. The model that WikiLeaks proposed, the model of being able to propose to insiders within organizations an ability to denounce abuses anonymously, and thus with a certain guarantee of impunity, is important. Well, this model, this modus operandi, was an existential threat to all corrupt structures. And I insist on corrupt structures because, starting from the idea that WikiLeaks spied and revealed things, it is easy to understand that WikiLeaks did not denounce and has never denounced good deeds. It is not the good deeds that the whistleblowers transmit in the hope of making them public. It is indeed a question of embezzlement, and, in this case, speaking of publications of 2010, truly war crimes. And here the media have done their job of stifling WikiLeaks, because when WikiLeaks releases a video, okay, it gets media attention, but in reality, very little is reported about the content. The repression that came down upon Julian Assange and WikiLeaks was equal to the real or perceived existential threat they posed. It was clear that the U.S. administration, in short, was determined, 1, not to let this model work normally, and 2, above all, not to allow it to repeat itself. To go after Assange, therefore, required not simply neutralizing the organization, but it required an intimidation to make clear that it was dangerous to fight for its right to inform. You know that Assange was accused of being a sexual abuser, a rapist, this kind of stuff. In the meantime, we have proof that it was a frame-up. It was the journalist Stefania Marizzi of La Repubblica, an Italian investigative journalist, who got us the emails exchanged between the two prosecutors that show collusion. We know that the arrest warrant issued by the Swedish prosecutor was irregular. We know that the British were forced to change the law after arresting Julian Assange because of the irregularity of their arrest warrant, but in the end accepted. We know that the trap had closed around Julian Assange's ankle, like a wolf caught in a trap, and he knew that he was expected in Sweden to be sent to the United States for the serious crime of having allowed us to know the truth. So he took refuge in the embassy, where the British took extraordinary measures, never before seen for a person who was formally accused of nothing, since the prosecutor, Marianne Ny, had only launched a preliminary investigation and nothing else. 7 years in an embassy of 70 square meters without being able to see the light of day, WikiLeaks was able to continue to act, and did even more by saying, this is what I believe, saving the life of Edward Snowden by organizing his escape, if I may say so, from Hong Kong. Few people know this, but Edward Snowden owes his present freedom to Julian Assange. Unfortunately, all the attempts to regularize his situation, all the attempts to set up humanitarian channels to cure him of his lung disease, his shoulder problem, his broken tooth, everything failed, largely due to the bad will of Great Britain, which treated Assange worse than the way it had treated the dictator Pinochet, who in his time had benefited from a 4-star hotel and humanitarian measures. The determination to capture Assange was stated loud and clear, with an embassy surrounded night and day by British police officers at the cost to the American taxpayer of tens of millions of pounds sterling. Later, as you know, the Ecuadorian government was to change, and the betrayal by the new president, Lenin Moreno, was blatant. He reneges on all the commitments made. He violates the Constitution, and almost at the same time it becomes clear that Julian Assange had been the subject of a full-fledged spy operation by the very company that was in charge of security at the embassy, UC Global, which is now on trial in Madrid. The fact that Lenin Moreno went on to betray almost all of his promises, including to his voters, violated the Ecuadorian constitution itself, made life impossible for Julian Assange, and attempted all means available to push him out of the embassy, for example, by turning off the heating in his room, by installing new staff who became very aggressive with him, by setting up impractical visiting conditions, by cutting off his internet communications, by accusing him of organizing a world spy center from the embassy, etc. In short, even by accusing him of covering the walls of the embassy with his excrement. This is what the president of Ecuador said at a press conference. Of course, it was not known at the time that everything was recorded and filmed, and that all the madness surrounding Julian Assange could be demonstrated as a fraud, precisely because of their own espionage. This simple fact of having been spied on, including his lawyers and the journalists who visited him, even his doctors, should, because of the violation of the client-lawyer privilege, should have made any trial impossible in England. But, as we see throughout this case, legality has nothing to do with this story. So it was a question of getting their hands on the greatest journalist of the 21st century. And how would they do it? They were to proceed with a propaganda campaign to infiltrate people's minds very slowly over a period of 10 years, where urban legends would appear about what WikiLeaks is doing, the crimes allegedly committed by WikiLeaks, and also about the person of Julian Assange, presented as a mythomaniac, as a misogynist, as sometimes as an anti-Semite. In short, all the weapons known to destroy someone's personality. This campaign was not a surprise. In fact, it had been prepared by one of those private intelligence companies that gravitate around the CIA, the NSA, and the rest of that crowd. We're talking about the Stratfor Company, which is one of the main companies in charge of the fight against WikiLeaks. And we know this because a leak from the company was passed on to WikiLeaks. When Julian Assange was finally removed from the embassy in violation of international law, and even the Ecuadorian constitution, it only took a quarter of an hour for the British judge first to insult him and then to sentence him to 50 weeks in prison for violating what? his conditions of probation, which is a sentence that has never been more severe for someone who has committed such a crime, especially since he committed it to seek refuge and asylum in an embassy. But he will not just be sentenced to 50 weeks, but to 50 weeks in a high-security prison. We will see that this is the only case, to my knowledge, in Great Britain that a journalist accused of nothing in preventive detention is locked up in a high-security prison. The second shock that will really surprise you, but which is not really a surprise, is that at the moment, as if by chance, Sweden and the Swedish prosecutor Marianne Ny decides that finally it's a good time to abandon the case, as she had decided in 2007 to reopen it. In fact, the Swedes opened and closed the case 3 times, because it was necessary to give space to the real actor of this farce. I mean the United States Department of Justice, which during all this time was hidden backstage behind the curtains, but with their shoes protruding underneath. And here they came presenting themselves to ask for the extradition of Julian Assange. So already, if we stop and think about the words, because here we are in the middle of propaganda, extradition. Already there, we are in the middle of it. Extradition is sending someone back to a country where he has committed a crime, or sending him back to a country where he has to serve a sentence. Julian Assange is an Australian, which doesn't qualify him as a traitor to the United States. He is a journalist who worked in Europe, whose publishing house is based in Reykjavik, Iceland. It is therefore not actually an extradition. Julian Assange has never been under American jurisdiction. It is simply a well-established American habit of exercising extraterritoriality, a new extraterritoriality. And after their embargo law, the Americans have decided to apply an extraterritoriality to an Australian journalist on the basis of an old law from 1917, the Espionage Act. It is not, therefore, an extradition in the strict sense of the term. The word extradition is used by the press and by the Ministry of Justice to confuse the public in order to hide the following fact. Julian Assange is the subject of a sophisticated form of rendition, of forced kidnapping on British soil, disguised as an extradition. As far as Europe is concerned, especially London, it is about the equivalent of pulling a hood over his head and throwing him in the trunk of a car and taking him off to a wasteland. Not a single person found an anomaly and raised their finger to wonder what exactly was going on. So the urban legends and propaganda campaigns tried to turn Julian Assange and WikiLeaks into some kind of terrorist organization. That's how he was labeled. An agent of Russian forces, of course. And a whole panoply of epithets that served to slowly erase the passing years, to erase from the public's consciousness the memory of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who in 2010 had made the front page of Le Monde and Time magazine. He was the man of the year, the organization of the year. Today, there are a lot of people asking us who Julian Assange is. Yes, WikiLeaks reminds me of something. The greatest press adventure of the 21st century, the most promising experiment, has literally been erased from the collective consciousness. The trial that finally took place on September 7th will have seen the same strategy applied. The Americans will change several charges. The public knows the first ones that were launched in February, but in August, at the last minute, the Americans presented a whole new series of charges that had nothing to do with the first ones. And during the trial, they changed again their arguments and their guns, their weapons, by questioning witnesses who were prepared for charges that were 7 months old. So much so that they even tried to destabilize an important witness, Daniel Ellsberg, by sending him 300 pages at 3 o'clock in the morning, when he was supposed to testify at 6 o'clock in the morning. During this trial, we saw the Americans finally say out loud what everyone knew, that they gave themselves the right to come and get any journalist anywhere in the world under the Espionage Act of 1917. We saw a trial that almost took place behind closed doors, refusing by name the presence of about 50 NGOs, where 90 journalists had been accredited and not a single one came. In the room, there were only 4 people and a few rare witnesses who could tell us how the trial unfolded. We saw American lawyers who were extremely aggressive towards the witnesses, but who lost their footing in the face of witnesses of exceptional strength, losing ground to such an extent that we saw the American lawyer, Lewis, attacking his own witness after having forgotten that it was his witness, and he was so annoyed at not receiving the right answers. This operation to kidnap Julian Assange that is taking place before our eyes will probably succeed, despite all efforts, because of a parallel event to this trial: the silence of the media. Here in France, we have solidarity, several hundred people who are trying by all means to warn of the danger of what has just been done. The extraterritoriality of American laws and their affirmation means that no journalist is safe anywhere. The justification employed for prosecuting a journalist abroad is important. It's interesting. Their justification is that since he published on the internet, it is as though he published everywhere in the world, and therefore in the United States. Therefore, for all of us who would like to defend our right to know, who believe they could be safe anywhere, far away, well, no, they would not be safe. Apparently, the paradigm is changing. A new era is opening up, and from the most absolute silence, we have probably fallen into an information war as we have never seen it before. It is clear that the people targeted are not mainstream journalists, but real investigative journalists and the so-called alternative media. In the conclusion, I have only one thing to say to you. Imagine a world with WikiLeaks, a world without WikiLeaks, decide what you would prefer, and act accordingly. Thank you.
If you're just joining us, we want to welcome you to panel 1 of our Schiller Institute conference, Creating a World Based on Reason. And we are in this panel, it's called Hang Together or Hang Separately, Free and Sovereign Republics or Digital Dictatorship. Our next speaker is Harley Schlanger, who's from the board of directors of the Schiller Institute and who was a presenter 2 weeks ago at the International Investigative Commission for Truth in Elections. He speaks to us today on the topic, what are the principles and facts concerning the recent U.S. election?
Thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by asking you to think for a moment about the title of this conference, Creating a World Based on Reason. We're in the midst of a fast-moving, fluid, and dangerous situation, driven by what can only be described as a criminal conspiracy to place the world on the edge of a possible nuclear war, while imposing a top-down global banking dictatorship run by central banks, the so-called global reset, and demanding a drastic reduction of physical economic production in the name of a green policy, all enforced by U.S. military might. This is not exactly a world based on reason. We now see the Texas legal case, which some saw as a last effort to overturn the election theft, rejected by the Supreme Court. Now, this is not shocking, given the insistence that the charges of irregularities, statistical anomalies, all the evidence of hundreds of affidavits and so on, was rejected by the establishment, repeatedly trashed in the media. And it's clear that there's a rallying around around a would-be Obama 3.0 administration, nominally run by a doddering figure, that is Joe Biden. So as we gather today and tomorrow in this conference, we must put forward this appeal for reason, for the marshaling of creativity. From this conference should come a clarion call for the best among us to rededicate our efforts to realize the best intentions of those who came before us, who fought for centuries, committed to developing institutions of self-government in which the people would act in their own self-interest in sovereign nations, which would maximize freedom in pursuit of the common aims of all mankind. This was best developed in the American system, especially as through the work of Lyndon LaRouche, by identifying the relationship between human creativity, productive advances, the increases of productivity to improve the standard of living for a growing number of people. LaRouche's concept of potential relative population density. Now, the present situation is dominated by strategic insanity, a war hawk neocon operation on steroids, you might say. Endless wars based on lies, false flag operations. There is now an intention to put forward the idea that we can fight and win a nuclear war, which is coming from the same war hawks and neocons committed to a post-Cold War world order based on US military might enforcing a global banker's dictatorship. A major part of this is the operations to provoke Russia, to create regime change in Russia, to move against China, to encircle and contain China. And it should occur to people that the same forces involved in the regime change in the United States, the 4-year-long effort to get rid of Donald Trump, is being run by the same people pushing for regime change in Russia and China. And why is that? Because these three countries represent the best hope for a world of sovereign nation states cooperating to address the crises that confront all of us. We look at the economic policy, speaking of strategic insanity, neoliberalism, the idea of free trade, of globalization, with the idea of globalization not countries working together in common interests, but nations in a Darwinian struggle, being forced into conflict with each other, while perched on top of them is a supranational regime, whether it's the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, all of these international agencies which operate on behalf of global corporate cartels, serving the interests of less than 1% of the wealthiest in the world, while condemning the rest of the world into a fight for survival of the fittest. This is what free trade is. And what's proclaimed as economic growth are bailouts and bubbles, the granting of cheap or almost unlimited credit to speculative swindlers who buy and sell worthless financial instruments based on liquidity provided by the central banks, while demanding austerity from the vast majority of the populations of the world. This killer austerity is responsible for our inability to address global pandemics. It's also responsible for creating global famine of biblical proportions, which David Beasley of the World Food Program has already killed 7 million people through starvation and threatens as many as 260 million more in 2021. We see a push for the Green New Deal, climate hysteria based on fake science, which is really a thinly disguised measure for population reduction, by basically arguing that there are limited resources and each nation or each people within nations will have to fight for a share of a shrinking economic pie. Now, we're seeing these policies being imposed at a moment of a global systemic collapse. It's scripted by a global military-industrial complex, enforced by US military power, to some extent NATO. It uses information control, better known as censorship. Now, who's behind this? Well, we see the Davos billionaires, the Silicon Valley, big tech has now been brought into the military-industrial complex. But the so-called military-industrial complex, or deep state, is really a British imperial design run by the City of London and Wall Street, enforced by the Five Eyes intelligence operation, using censorship, denying sovereignty to nations to be able to determine their own direction. So think for a moment. This is going to fail. There's no way this will succeed unless the goal of success is nuclear annihilation. But more importantly, it's being rejected by governments all over the world, which represent a majority of the world's population. Increasingly rejected by the American people, rejected by people of Western Europe as we see the established parties collapsing in election after election. So the question then is posed to us, what is the opportunity for us? What can we do to create this world based on reason? Now go back for a moment to 2016. We saw a global insurgency against the establishment, starting with Brexit, then with the election of Donald Trump in the United States, and then with the collapse of political parties all over Western Europe, government after government, moving into positions of minority control, yet imposing policies rejected by most of the people living in those countries. The European Union is a perfect example of this. Now, what was the Trump victory in 2016 based on? Number one, end the endless wars. Break with the policy of the Project for a New American Century, the neocons in both political parties in the United States that put us into war after war based on fake intelligence, actually based on lies, that told us that we had to destroy nations such as Iraq, such as Libya, such as Syria, such as Ukraine, in defense of what? Democracy? There was no democracy or democratic intent behind this. It was an intention to punish nations that did not accept the imposition of this new global regime. So Trump said, we're going to end those endless wars, and that was very popular with the American people, especially because Hillary Clinton was one of the architects as part of this global establishment, one of the architects of these wars. End the bailouts. While this was not a huge part of his campaign, President Trump, as a candidate, called for the reinstitution of Glass-Steagall banking separation, which would have stopped the bailouts, stopped the bail-ins. Then he called for infrastructure investment, which would have created jobs in high-end frontier technologies, which is absolutely essential. An outline in Trump's way, which reflected the LaRouche 4 basic laws of economic advances. He came out against the free trade agreements, immediately pulling the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and against the fake science of the Green New Deal by removing the United States from the Paris Climate Accord. Most importantly, he engaged in personal diplomacy, where he advanced the idea of friendship and cooperation with Russia and China through early summit meetings with Putin and Xi Jinping, and coordinated with them an effort to end the threat of nuclear confrontation with North Korea. This was, of course, sabotaged by the war party, but nevertheless, that was his intent. Now, how did the war party react? How did the establishment react to Trump? Russiagate. 4 years of lies, smears, and slanders against Trump, against Russia and President Putin, and against the American people who voted for President Trump precisely to end these wars and to become friends and collaborators with Russia and China. After the Russiagate collapsed for not only lack of evidence, but evidence that it was a conspiracy to destroy the United States as a sovereign nation, they ran the Ukrainian impeachment, and then a continuing series of lies about Trump the racist, Trump the authoritarian, nonstop slander and smears. And anyone who defended him was attacked as being part of a conspiracy theory around Trump. Now let's jump to today. What do we have? We have an election in the United States which was riddled with irregularities and fraud. It's still not settled. Despite what the media says, there is evidence of fraud. And there's still an opportunity to bring this before legislatures, which have the responsibility under the Constitution to select the electors who will be meeting on Monday. But it's not finalized until the Electoral College results are presented to the Congress at the beginning of January. Now, how does the media handle this? They claim Trump, in charging election fraud, is pushing a conspiracy theory, and that his supporters are part of a conspiracy theory. The great unwashed, uneducated, low education voters is the way these snots of the media present this. Now, think back for a second. What's the biggest conspiracy theory we've ever seen? Russiagate. The idea that Russia meddled in the 2016 election on behalf of Donald Trump, that Putin sent his army of bots onto the internet to convince Americans to vote for Trump, and that this, combined with the hacking, the alleged hacking of the Democratic National Committee computers, Hillary's computers, John Podesta's computers, that this was all done to illegally make Donald Trump the president. That's a conspiracy theory. And yet that's an accepted conspiracy theory. But this was in reality a criminal conspiracy run by the City of London, by the intelligence services of London, MI6, GCHQ, in cooperation with the Obama intelligence team, John Brennan, James Clapper, who lied that there's no surveillance state, the FBI and the US media, all combined to tie up the president for 4 years so he could not proceed with his intention of meeting with Putin, meeting with Xi Jinping, and hammering out cooperative agreements that would represent the best interests of the sovereign nation states of the United States, Russia, and China. The media was a key part of this. The censorship to keep the wars going. The lies and attacks on such people as Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. In the case of Assange, someone whose crime was reporting the truth about the lying military and intelligence operations keeping us in these wars, and instead vilifying him as opposed to seeing him as a hero who was speaking the truth to power. So they controlled the narrative. Let me just give you a couple of examples. After the Trump summit with Putin in July 2018, where they talked about hammering out a new agreement on nuclear arms so that the arms race would end, instead of spending trillions on weapons, horrible weapons that could annihilate humanity, why not put that money instead into education, healthcare, infrastructure development? And after President Trump as he held a press conference to report this, all the media wanted to know is, did you confront Putin about meddling in the US election? And President Trump said, no, I trust Putin more than I trust my intelligence services. It turns out he was right. The intelligence services lied. The media lied. But that pretty much put an end to the potential for personal diplomacy between the two and opened the door for new sanctions, the eastward advance of NATO forces to the borders of Russia, and so on. A second example of this conspiracy. Look at the Ukraine situation. A coup was carried out in full support of the United States military and intelligence community in February 2014. Who was the coordinator for the United States for this? Joe Biden. Biden worked with networks of regime changer George Soros, with the PNAC crowd around Victoria Nuland, the Project for a New American Century, all the NGOs that finance regime change, and most importantly, that worked on behalf of imposing an oligarchical regime in Ukraine that had Nazis in its security forces, that opened fire on Maidan Square, that created the basis for the so-called freedom for Ukraine. Now, who was supporting that? Joe Biden. But what did the media do? They allowed the Ukraine issue to be reduced to a question of Hunter Biden's kleptomania, that Hunter Biden was corrupt, Joe Biden was corrupt. Well, what else is new? How many politicians become millionaires through their political service? But the real issue, forget the millions that they took. The real issue is they engaged with Nazis in a coup that put us on the edge of war with Russia. That should have been the Ukraine story that the American people could think about when we came into the election. So where do we stand now? Well, Millions of people in the United States have been awakened to the fact that we have a corrupt establishment that's committed not to the general welfare, as our Constitution requires government to be, but committed to the enrichment of 1% of the population. Trump got 5 million more votes, even without taking into consideration the prospect of theft. 5 million more votes than in 2016. There's an awakening. But there's an awakening around the world. But how do they deal with that? By turning people into their profiles, left and right, liberal, conservative, communist versus patriot. And we end up with an enemy image of people who are actually should be our allies. People miss the big picture. The big picture is the question of physical economy. Can we revive the American system to produce enough to ensure that we're not in a situation where we have to make choices of triage, triaging the elderly, triaging the sick, triaging the poor? Can we marshal human creativity through a classical culture, which gives people the ability to think of the big picture and not get trapped in the narratives? And the real issue then is the republic and the nation state versus the empire. It's not enough to vote and march. We have to have solutions. There are a few things President Trump can do in the time he has left, assuming that he does not overturn the election. Full disclosure, get all the documents on Russiagate into the public hands, on Ukraine, on the election, on 9/11, the JFK assassination. There's so much classified material that needs to come out, including in the surveillance state since 9/11. Secondly, you want to get the evidence on the election? Appoint a special prosecutor. That's all I'll say on that. Third, pardon Edward Snowden and bring him back and drop the charges against Julian Assange and have the two of them talk about what they know about the surveillance state, about the corrupt wars, about the lies, and so on. And then finally, President Trump can go meet with Putin. Take the time between now and Inauguration Day to work out an agreement where the two nations can cooperate in dealing with the problems in the world. We have to change the axioms. A world based on reason means that people break out of the controlled situation defined by bad choices. Lyndon LaRouche once said, quoting a Yiddish proverb, "When you have two bad choices, always take the third." Well, we represent the third choice, a world based on reason, on the American system, on sovereign nation states cooperating to address the common aims of mankind. That's the potential we have now. That's what we have to do. Seize this moment to get as many people as possible thinking about the big picture and about the potential, the great, beautiful potential of humanity working together, addressing the common interests of mankind. I would urge you to join with us in the Schiller Institute to bring about that world based on reason. Thank you.
Our next presenter is David Christie, formerly of the Policy Committee of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, who will be speaking on the topic, The British Empire's Digital Dictatorship, Censorship, and Mass Social Control.
Okay, what I'd like to present here is on the ongoing coup d'etat against our nation via the election theft of Donald Trump, and the censorship and social engineering, social media kind of operations that are all part of this ongoing coup d'etat. I think we should recognize is that this is a color revolution, or at least one form of it, and has been an ongoing color revolution against our country, but other nations as well, particularly those nations that LaRouche identified that would be critical to break the back of the British Empire, the City of London financial crowd, their branch office in Wall Street, and their tentacles into the banking and cartel structures globally, those four nations of Russia, China, India, and the United States would be absolutely required to break the back of the British system and their planned Great Reset of central bankers' dictatorship, via digital currency, the green genocide program, which is absolutely what it is. It's just genocide of killing people off through denial of critical energy needs and so forth, food production. All that will be covered in the course of this conference. But that, again, that these other nations have been targets of similar color revolution operations that may have their different characters to them. Certainly Hong Kong, we saw what happened there in terms of the street operations, the riots. This, of course, is directed at the leadership of Xi Jinping, the Navalny case against Russia. And then we see the slew of other nations that have worked with these nations around the development of a new system that would move beyond the British system. And this is this implementation of the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, but as was developed by Lyndon LaRouche and his wife Helga Zepp LaRouche. That's a critical means by which we replace the dying, dead, and gone British system before they get their great reset in. And so the nations of the Middle East, Southwest Asia, the nations of Northern Africa, that would be an integral part of the transit routes into Europe and so on, those nations have been targeted all along with these color revolution operations. Libya, Syria, Egypt, you've seen all the different aspects. The other, of course, critical nation was Ukraine. That was perhaps one of the most blatant operations. And then, of course, we have the operation in Belarus right now. So these color revolutions, I think, is notable because, number one, those nations actually view this as an act of warfare. And I'll just briefly show a still from the 2014 Third Moscow Conference on International Security, where they essentially discussed that color revolutions they view as a form of warfare, not just simply a hodgepodge of media and social media and non-governmental organizations that just somehow magically achieve a regime change operation because of the corruption of whatever leadership they're attempting to overthrow. They actually view this as a concerted, coordinated operation that is akin to warfare in terms of regime change. So that's how those nations view it. I think we should just keep that in mind. I think it's also relevant, the fact that Putin referred to the operations against Trump from this standpoint. So back when, just in January of 2017, when Trump was actually being inaugurated, we had the street demonstrations. Putin's reference to this, I think, is useful. He says, in my opinion, there are several goals. Some are obvious. He talks about how this actually will undermine the street operations and so on, would undermine the legitimacy of the President of the United States. He says it would damage U.S. interests. But I think what he says here, it seems that they trained in Kiev for this in Kiev. And of course, Joe Biden was the point man. Probably didn't do a whole lot, or the others were carrying it out, but nonetheless. And now they are ready to organize a Maidan in Washington, not to let Trump assume office. The second goal is to tie the hands and legs of the newly elected president related to the implementation of his pre-election campaign's promises to the American people and the international community. So that was Putin's statement on this. I think that's relevant. This is what we're actually dealing with. And again, as I mentioned, these types of color revolution operations are directed against all nations. Now, a critical component of the color revolutions is the control of information, or really preventing the spread of ideas, which are more relevant to this kind of moment. But we've seen this with the censorship that's obviously gone off the rails with the Hunter Biden story. That was a lot of Americans' first eye-opening experience, but now they're just, any objections to the election theft are just being banned on the internet. And this is done through this Section 230, which I will read a relevant section of this. Section 230, as Trump is saying, should be repealed, and otherwise he will not allow for the National Defense Authorization Act unless there's a clause to repeal that. That Section 230 is of the 1996 Communication Decency Act, and this gives the so-called sword and shield to these internet platform companies, the big tech so-called. The shield side is the liability from allowing third-party agencies to post and not having to be legally liable for all the content. The sword part, there's sort of an obvious aspect of copyright infringement, sex trafficking, child porn, these different elements that should be cleared off, and these effectively have to do that. But then what Section 230 and the so-called Good Samaritan Clause do is they go even beyond that to say that material deemed obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected. That is in Section 230. I mean, they're just basically saying First Amendment doesn't exist as long as it's all done in, quote, good faith. So this is one of the key aspects that has given these companies the ability to do what we're seeing in terms of this mass censorship. But this is all part of the architecture embedded in these things because they were designed from the very get-go for the large-scale social engineering that we are now seeing and certainly as part of these color revolution operations. And I just want to give a brief background on the field of social network analysis and the people that developed this, called the International Network of Social Network Analysis. I wrote a paper in 2007, published in EIR, entitled INSNA, the International Network of Social Network Analysis, Handmaidens of British Colonialism, which was actually a term. This Handmaidens of Colonialism was from a professor, Henrika Kuklik, who identified that sociologists and anthropologists operating in colonial Africa were the handmaidens of their colonial masters, that they were sent there on behalf to profile and identify how the social networks worked in tribal structures or emerging countries or nationalist movements that were developing, and that this then was material by these sociologists and anthropologists was fed back to the British Foreign Office and the other relevant colonial agencies in other countries in order to suppress and subvert and make sure that the colonial policy could continue. The diamond mines and the gold mines and so forth could keep lining the pockets of the British imperial networks. So the reason that's relevant is the Handmaidens of Colonialism that was referred to. A particular agency was called the Rhodes Livingstone Institute out of Zambia, Rhodesia at the time, I believe. This was in the 30s, 40s. I don't know exactly when it went out of business. Maybe it's still around in some form or another. Actually, I know it's around the social network analysis grouping, but founder or members of the Rhodes Livingstone Institute like J.A. Barnes, J.C. Mitchell, they were initial founders of the social network analysis grouping that I mentioned. The other relevant point around the intellectual forefathers of this social network analysis crew, which developed the tools to exploit social networks, particularly applied to social media, although they had much more broader perspective on social networking in general than just social media. But the other relevant grouping that developed into social network analysis was the group called sociometry, headed up by Jacob Moreno. Moreno's sociograms, at least he's attributed with developing them, were part of these profiling operations. You identify the nodes, the people, the connections between them, what that social network looked like as a mathematical model. Today they have 3D models that are, very vast and capable of figuring out who's talking to who's the big idea generators, and so on. Sociometry, I think, is relevant to look at because they were kind of a nexus point of media, polling, public relations, opinion research, all these different elements. And other notable members of sociometry included, John Dewey, included some of the Tavistock crowd, the likes of Kurt Lewin, Margaret Mead, Paul Lazarsfeld, and then on the media side was Frank Stanton of CBS. There was Gallup of Gallup Polls, and Lazarsfeld, Frank Stanton, and Gallup were part of the Princeton Radio Research Project. Of the people remember the War of the Worlds that was broadcast out of this grouping. They had polling operations. There was ways that they even set up things where viewers could sit home with a dial and have their likes and dislikes during different shows, soap operas, and things like that. So this is kind of the first push at the kind of integration of media, polling, public relations, etc. So that is at least to give you a sense of some of the background of this social network analysis grouping. where they came from, what the direction they were going is. Now, of course, it should be fairly obvious to everybody that they're profiling people. The other aspect of this is just on the digital construct in general. Just to be aware of this, they viewed the human mind and social relations along the very notion of digital concepts, of zeros and ones, of electrical impulses on and off, which is how you create programs, that this was similar to a human existence. We were just passive beings that said yes or no, like or dislike, avoid pleasure, seek pleasure, avoid pain, a very animalistic view of human society. But this is how they actually game and create what's called the Reesian choice, named for John Rawlings' Rees of Tavistock. That is, I think, just relevant to consider that, you know, when you sit there and do the like or dislike or send or not send, you're effectively agreeing to the terms of what the program was that was given to you. And the reason I reference that is what is required at this kind of a moment is to say, no, we're not accepting the terms of these Reesian choices, but we're going to go to the higher poetic conceptions that give the actual competent ideas to deal with the unfolding crisis that we see globally. And certainly that is the method of Nicholas of Cusa, the coincidence of opposites, that Helga has been emphatic that we get that kind of a dialogue going. And so that ultimately is the kind of antidote to this sort of large-scale behavior modification, social engineering that we see from these heirs of Tavistock and these other kind of agencies. And the critical thing that they developed was the idea of group dynamics, that was far more effective than the individual brainwashing methods of electroshock therapy or drugs or whatever. Group dynamics said, don't you just want to be accepted and part of the herd, you know? And so just to maybe have a sense of that battlefield, but the higher ideas, the higher poetic conceptions of the coincidence of opposite are absolutely required to get people to think outside of what they've been programmed with. So I think I'll leave it there and take up whatever questions people may have in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So in a moment, we're going to begin our question and answer and discussion process. Just before we bring the entire set of speakers up on screen, we're going to hear from someone who's calling in, William Binney, well known throughout the world for his work at the National Security Agency as a whistleblower coming out of that agency now almost 20 years ago. And he has a few things that he'd like to share. He was also a presenter 2 weeks ago at the International Investigative Commission. And on the topic of digital dictatorship, there's probably not a greater authority presently in the world. So, Bill?
Thank you, Dennis. I'd like to address two basic things here. First, I'd like to say I've been reading about the case that Ty Clevenger, who's a lawyer representing Ed Butowski in a lawsuit involving FBI and the discovery of information about the Seth Rich exchange of data with WikiLeaks. And it just came out today that the FBI suddenly found over 20,000 pages of information related to Seth Rich. And they also had his computer, and on that computer, they talked about, or at least been reported today, that on that computer was evidence of him passing information, emails from the DNC to WikiLeaks, asking for money for the rest of them or something of that nature. That's basically what Cy Hirsch's conversation was all about, that was recorded by Ed Butowski, I believe, early on, and that was what was posted on the web, and people heard that, and but Cy wouldn't publicly say anything about it because he didn't want to compromise his sources. But what that does, it says that the FBI has known all along, even before the inauguration of President Trump, that the information that WikiLeaks published had nothing to do with the Russians. It had an insider doing that job. Now, we knew that from forensics of the data that was published by WikiLeaks, simply by looking at the last modified times on all the 35,813 emails that were posted. They all had the same even ending numbers in terms of last modified time. that was clearly a forensic proof that the data was downloaded to a thumb drive or CD-ROM, some memory stick, and then physically transported before WikiLeaks could post it, which said to us it was an inside job. We couldn't say who it was that did it, but we could say it was an inside job, not a hack coming from Russia, extracting data across them. And that was the same, I think it was in January 2017, that Henry, I forget his full name, but he used to be the CEO of CrowdStrike, was testifying to the House Intelligence Committee. And he said that they had evidence that the data was prepared for exfiltration, but they never saw it being exfiltrated. That's because it didn't go across the web. It went down to a thumb drive. And when it did, it probably modified the times on file in terms of the data stored in the DNC. And that's how he said it was prepared to be exfiltrated. So, but he never really said how. So all of that says to me, all of this thing, the lie from the beginning has been known and is provable now to be known by the FBI as well as everybody else. And the same was true with Guccifer 2. And all the information we had in Guccifer 2 at that time said it was a lie too. And all the evidence we could find in terms of what happened with the data in Guccifer 2 and all of that, in terms of the modifying the data and stuff, all of that pointed back to CIA as the origin of Guccifer 2. And the timestamps all said that it was occurring somewhere inside the United States, on the East Coast primarily. But it's still, the use of that Marble Framework program being said that in WikiLeaks in the Vault 7 material said it was used once in 2016, and we tied that with that Guccifer 2 material that he posted on the 15th of June of 2016. And that clearly, again, and that was also found later on, published by WikiLeaks in the Podesta emails. And in the Guccifer 2 emails, the Russian fingerprints were there, but in the posted WikiLeaks data, those fingerprints were not there, which said that Guccifer 2 inserted them. And that's typical of what the Marble Framework program did. And Vault 7 said it was used once in 2016. We said, well, there it is. And it all points back, CIA was the origin of this. Now, I told this to Pompeo when he was director of CIA. I said, all these agencies are lying to you and the president. And, and he said he couldn't believe that because he thought, well, all these are good Americans here. Well, he's finding out they're not. And it's coming out now more and more that we have a real corrupt set of criminals in charge of our government down there. And they're the bureaucrats. They're not the elected people. They only go along, they go along to get along internally in the government. The real bureaucrats are the ones running the place. And that's what the IC and all of this has been about. So, and the election fraud, this is the other issue I wanted to address. About June of this year, we sent, I think it was 54 registered letters to all the secretaries of states of all the states in the United States and Guam and Puerto Rico and 2 others, saying that there are ways to fix the and validate and rely on a real outcome of accurate count of any voting process, and we would love to talk to you about it. Well, we heard from 0 of them. None of them responded whatsoever. And so now this vote came along, and you see this video of people stuffing ballots into the voting system after hours after they threw everybody else out. Why? They didn't want them to notice that, but they didn't realize they were being photographed by a camera all the time. So after they threw the witnesses, the press, and the Republicans out to monitor the voting counts, after they threw them out, they pulled these things out from under the table and started throwing them in the machine. Well, so if you went back and we were advocating looking at bulk information on those ballots and also using things like census, US phone white pages, yellow pages, Social Security dead lists of dead people, and also those who have Social Security numbers and so on, and using all that data, just crunching it together and saying, here's the reliable, valid data of all eligible US voters in the country. And so we could, by polling place, say, here are all the eligible voters that can come in and vote in your country. And if we had taps on all the voting as it occurred, we could monitor that as it occurred in real time, not after the fact. Or none of this late counting or that crap. Everything would be done right there. And it would be done once for every valid person, no matter where they were living, in what state or whatever. They could have moved, they could be in different places, but they were allowed to vote one time. And that we could have figured out. And so we went and started looking at some of this data that some of us had access to, and we found that in the case of, and I tweeted this out, in the case of Georgia, there were almost 2 million people with the same birth date of 1 January, different years, but the same birth date. Now, if you just said, okay, there should be an equal number of people born on any given day of the year, that's 365 times almost 2 million, which is like 730 million people must live in Georgia. So that tells you there's something wrong there, but that doesn't say these people are guilty or anything, and these ballots are bad. It says you need to look at them to verify them. Now, you look at other things like clustering and a time of input, like those people that input all those files after they threw everybody out and then started throwing these ballots from under the table into the vote counting machines, they should cluster in time. And if that happened, then a cluster in time showed that commonality with all these birth dates of 1 January, then you know this is just more additional evidence of fraud. Now, I'm sitting here, I'm asking myself, and I'm going to have to start tweeting about this, because where's the FBI? Where's the Department of Justice? What are they doing? Why aren't they investigating these people who are perpetuating this fraud on the voting? I mean, they should be going after Title 18, Code 8, U.S. Code 52 is the one that deals with election crimes. Why aren't they pursuing this? This is obviously some criminal activity going on with the evidence of that video. Why aren't they after those people to find out? Another thing. The guy in the center of it, that seemed to be the central point of it, was on the phone after everybody was thrown out. And then he hung it up. And then after they got all the votes and ballots, and he got back on the phone again after it was done. And then they left. Well, that says that it might be we're starting the action and then we're ending the action, and he's talking to somebody else. So who is that? Well, let me tell you. NSA's got a record of all those phone calls inside the United States. And they could probably even get back to exactly what was being said and do a translation of that and follow and trace the entire social network of all the people who were involved in these states. They all closed down about the same time, roughly, to throw everybody out. And then all of a sudden, these massive amounts of ballots came in after the fact. And then it all tipped the balance back to Biden. So this is further evidence of coordinated conspiracy to subvert the election. And that phone call could trace out and get the basic input as to what these people, who they were involved with to do this and to achieve this. And therefore, by the FBI and so on, putting pressure on them to squeal and let it and open up the rest of the conspiracy, why all these people should be put right into jail for violating the law. And not only that, I mean, it's just unfathomable to me that Americans would do this, would actually turn us into a banana republic. This is exactly what Stalin did and all the dictators and the banana republics do. Let's fix the voting. As Stalin said, or is attributed to him anyway, doesn't matter who votes or how they vote, only matters who counts the vote. And that's what we have here.
Thank you very much, Bill. Bill Binney was at the National Security Agency for 36 years. He is the inventor of the universal surveillance system known as Thin Thread. His team, consisting of Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis, and also later Tom Drake, as well as Diane Rourke, tried their best to use that system or deploy that system. It was capable of preventing the 9/11 attacks from occurring had its use not been discouraged by Michael Hayden and others at National Security Agency at the time. Ed Snowden and others have spoken of Bill as a pioneer in the pursuit of truth against digital dictatorship. We thank him for what he does and what he's just done. What we're now going to do is go to our full panel, and who with us will have Harley Schlanger, who you've just heard, Dave Christie, our two attorneys, Marino El Saviv and Dave Meiswinkle, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and I'm joined by my co-host, Diane Sayre. So we've got everybody there, and I'd just like to first ask for the various people on the panel what observations they may have, what reflections in terms of all of what you've heard, and also what has just been said. So Helga, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go around and get others.
Well, I think that all of what has been said requires further follow-up. I think the idea that this is a settled question obviously will not hold. I think Harley's proposal for a special prosecutor and the other proposals he made are fully to be endorsed. And I think, the outcome of this is not a question pertaining to the United States alone, but, if the United States goes in the wrong way, then I'm afraid this will have implications for every corner of the world. So therefore, I can only encourage as many people as possible to get engaged in this fight, because it does affect the future of us all.
Okay, let me go to one of our attorneys. Dave Meiswinkle, you have anything?
Yeah, no, I agree with the sentiments of Helga. I think we've hit the fork in the road. And as the famous New York Yankee baseball player Yogi Berra would say, when you hit the fork in the road, take it, which means that we have to decide what fork to take. Unfortunately, we're being dealt from a deck that's not doesn't have integrity. So this is, I think, bringing to the forefront, though, a lot of sentiment of people that they maybe don't even know. They're being sensitized to their roots as Americans and the entire American experiment having to do with democracy and freedom in the world, and us being a beacon of light for the rest of the world. That certainly will become dim if not reversed here. So it takes now the time to get down in the trenches, so to speak, and reformulate, just as you're doing here in this program, the strategy to go forward. But I think now these people have come to the forefront. They've been exposed, and that's bringing the people that haven't been paying attention, they're starting to pay attention. So I think there's a positive side, because it's awakening so many of the American people.
Okay, Harley, how about you?
I'd like to go back to what Bill said at the end of his presentation, Bill Binney, where he identified the basis of an investigation into fraud. President Trump had said, I think about a week and a half ago, that he was considering appointing a special prosecutor. And immediately the media went nuts and said, why would you do that? Well, the whole idea of a special prosecutor is to determine if there was a criminal violation that took place. And the argument of the media that there was no evidence of fraud is clearly wrong. And it's so wrong that that same media is trying to censor any discussion of it. So what would the harm be if there was no fraud? Why wouldn't people who support Joe Biden want to have that brought to the forefront by having a special prosecutor? They're trying to hide something. And I think what Bill identified were a whole series of investigative leads that should be taken up by a special prosecutor. And if you do combine that with a full declassification and unredaction of the documents which show what was done by the special prosecutor that was appointed, the special counsel that was appointed to look into Donald Trump and Russiagate, that turned out to be a complete fraud. It showed that there was nothing but a fabrication. Well, let's do that now on the election. And I think what you're going to find is the people who supported the special counsel operation to destroy the Trump administration will raise holy hell to stop a special prosecutor from being able to look into the criminal fraud perpetrated against every voter in the recent election.
Let me just ask if Mr. El-Saviv wishes to say something, and let me let everybody know that the we are going to have a translation involved. So just recognize there'll be a bit of a delay.
Sí. Buenos días. ¿Me escuchan?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
¿Me escuchan?
Yes.
Buenos días. Repito, es una alegría saludar a todo el panel y a todas las personas que nos escuchan. En especial a doña Helga, a quien tanto admiramos en ella y en la persona de nuestro gran líder.
It's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to greet all of you, and especially I would like to.
Debe primar el principio de la razón. Parecería como si sea. Okay.
Marino, puedes
hemos perdido el principio de la...
Marino, empiece de nuevo.
Sí. Muy buenos días a todos los miembros del panel y en especial a doña Helga LaRouche.
I'd like to give my greetings to everyone in the panel and especially to Helga LaRouche.
El recuerdo a nuestro gran líder, Lyndon LaRouche.
And especially our memory and recollection of our great leader, Lyndon LaRouche.
En este especial momento,
at this very special
de la
moment
crisis electoral,
of the electoral crisis,
debemos acudir al principio de la razón.
We have to take recourse to the principle of reason.
Analizar los testimonios,
to analyze
y verificar la tecnología
analyze the testimony which has been presented and to confirm
en estas elecciones norteamericanas.
And to confirm the technology which has been used in these U.S. elections.
Ahí reside la base de la investigación.
That's where the investigation must proceed.
Hay de igual forma una gran simulación y por demás una verdadera conjura a mi modo de apreciar.
Similarly, there has been
en
a great
que no se investiguen
simulation
las elecciones norteamericanas.
And in fact, a true conspiracy to not investigate the elections in the United States.
Pondría en descubierto a los actores tecnológicos y a los hilos dueños de esa tecnología que han interferido el voto del pueblo norteamericano.
And this would also help, if this were to occur, this would unmask
las elecciones en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica.
And this would also unmask the technological actors and the strings through which they carried out these activities and the owners of the technology through which they have carried out this fraud in the elections against the people of the United States.
Creo que con esto, aparte de lo que había dicho al principio, es mi intervención y estoy dispuesto a cualquier pregunta que pueda surgir del plenario de esta reunión virtual.
So these are my comments for now, in addition to what I said at the beginning, and I am happy to answer any questions that may come from this plenary gathering of this conference.
Okay, thank you. Dave Christie.
I'd just like to make one point, just concerning some of at least what I covered, relevant to where we're at right now. You know, many of these kind of academic circles that develop these different aspects that, you know, social network analysis, so forth, the layers around Tavistock and so on, Obviously these tools are then used by the intelligence agencies. The very support of these kind of private and academic circles often would come from the likes of the Rockefeller foundations and the kind of oligarchical interests that were interested in exploiting these kind of things. I think, though, that for some of those academic circles and so on, they may have a motivation which was often referred to as to fight against what they called the authoritarian personality. And then the way that the means by which to fight against the so-called authoritarian personality, which, oftentimes these academic circles were, promoting these ideas and so forth in the wake of the, fascist movements of Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, and so on. And the idea was to promote then democracy according to the concept of consensus, that's that really we should have governments and social relations based on this sort of democracy of consensus. And whereas this authoritarian personality concept was sort of applied to the dictators, it really is applied to anybody that exerts any sort of leadership based on actual principle. And I think that what you're seeing in terms of the nature of these color revolutions, as they, certainly going after Donald Trump, but similarly are going after the kind of leadership that is being exerted by the likes of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, other leaders around the world. And I think that we should just recognize that a lot of this idea of consensus and sort of being a part of the herd and so on, that this first off, we're not a democracy in that sense. We have a democratic process, but we have the principles of our republic, and it is a leadership principle to exert leadership based on those principles. That's really what's under attack here. And I think through these kind of digital means and so on, social media, so on and so forth, and that what is required now, and certainly we are seeing this, is the individuals who are standing up against what's occurred around this election fraud. But that ultimately is what is required to save this republic, is that personal leadership. And certainly I think Lyndon LaRouche was probably one of the greatest expressions of that quality of leadership, and certainly the moniker of authoritarian personality was often used against him. And so I just think that people should just have a sense that it's that what is required to save this republic is that quality of leadership based on principle now.
Before we, Bill, we're going to ask you for any closing remarks before we go to the next person. So if you've got anything, Bill, to say in response to what you've heard or anything else that you want to make sure people know. You're muted. Bill, you're muted.
Well, I just think that the idea of having a special prosecutor before if President Trump has to leave office, why he should have that set and started and in place, and make sure that they're and put it in such a way that they can't really get rid of it because it'll be too embarrassing. I guess, I don't know. Actually, the people involved, I just think there's just too many people. If you get the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, the intelligence community, and many members of Congress, as well as even in state governments, to organize this kind of fraud on a large scale like this across the entire country and coordinate the closing down and actions that followed after the election. Why it's just there's so many people involved here. They all are trying to cover up for each other. That's what the FBI is doing. That's what the entire administration's been doing. This whole government that we have really needs to be cleaned up. It's really criminal. And we really need to start doing something. That means, if it means creating a new party to get rid of the Democrats and Republicans, both of them, then we have to do that. But we, the people, have to stand up and start doing it and take our country back.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you for everything you've been doing. I just want to say, because some people asked me to do this again, is to make the point that the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche Legacy Foundation has the first volume out, are a project that we're centering a lot of our work on here at the Schiller Institute. And so if you want to get in touch with us around that, you see at the bottom of your screen how you can do that. It's available and for purchase. One volume, I think, is $50. Two of them are $75 each. And you can find out more about it. And also for those who are asking for how to ask questions, it's questions@schillerinstitute.org. So we welcome questions, and you can certainly get to us there. So I think we've got our second person who is up, who I believe is Leah Hoops from Pennsylvania. Is that the case? Okay, we're going to take a minute here just to bring her up. Yes, you're still muted there.
My apologies. Is it okay? I prepared.
Yeah, now you're all right.
It's just going to take a minute or two. Is that okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you again for allowing me to participate in this discussion, and to the Schiller Institute for the fight for reason, logic, democracy, and scientific advancement to ensure the prosperity of mankind. It's an honor to be among all of you and your great minds. Much like myself, Lyndon LaRouche, and anyone who challenges the system, we are labeled a conspiracy theorist. This is nothing short of fascism. My input is directed at election integrity and the importance of taking back the power of the republic. I'm a United States citizen witnessing the moral corruption, gaslighting of truth seekers, and violation of civil and constitutional rights. It is not only important to speak up about these issues, but also to unite, collaborate, and create alliances, as the solutions to these problems are in benefit of those around the world. What has been transpiring over the past 4 decades is the lack of consequence in the circumventing of the Constitution, both of the United States and in my own state of Pennsylvania. These constitutions were actually developed at the very same time and served to protect individual liberties and the separation of powers. The abuse that we're seeing in the separation of powers in my state specifically is the removing of the right to due process, the abuse of the separation of powers, and the right to petition and freedom of speech. As of right now, the executive branch and judicial branch in my state have created election laws under the guise of a pandemic. The separation of powers includes that the legislative branch obviously are the ones that create laws. The executive branch and the judicial branch have created unconstitutional laws during this election, which included the extension of mail-in ballots to be received 3 days post-election, no signature checks for mail-in ballots, and drop boxes in my county alone, which house 46% of the state's drop boxes. Every time the process is watered down, and the more hands that touch these ballots and these laws that are created to assist with the fraud, increases the vulnerability of fraud in itself. This disenfranchises every voter and citizen. Voting is a privilege and is not supposed to be convenient, but secure, transparent, and follow law passed through legislation. Violating the Constitution at this point has had absolutely no consequence, and any avenue or constitutional path for recourse for a citizen has been blocked. My right to petition is being turned down by a majority and rogue PA Supreme Court. Some branches of law enforcement that are to assist in my ability to observe and challenge questionable votes have stood down, and an attorney general of my state who sent 2 special agents to my home unannounced felt like intimidation. He actually made a quote this morning in response to the Texas attorney general. He said, and he quotes and quoted, "The court should not abide the seditious abuse of the judicial process and should send a clear and unmistakable signal that such abuse must never be replicated." So my question, why hasn't there been an investigation launched by my attorney general? Why haven't those accused been exonerated? How do I turn to an attorney general and judicial branch when we are being intimidated, told we are seditious, and to keep our mouth shut? This violates my First Amendment right to speak and to petition and due process. At this point in time in the United States is just another banana republic. What better way to take over a nation and to take away freedoms than to remove civic education from public schools and higher education systems? Only 26% of Americans can name the 3 branches of government, and many do not understand their role. Much like Hitler, our youth is being bombarded with socialist, communist, radical ideology and creating mindless foot soldiers, all the while becoming comfortable in their servitude. So what is the path to the way back? It is straight through. The United States needs to take back education and fight back against the suppression of speech by big tech. We have created a vulnerability in our educational system and need to save our youth. I propose to make mandatory civic education for kindergarten through 12th grade, and to find and remove any professor that promotes radicalized ideology that promotes the destruction of the United States. What am I doing on a small scale? With others, I've created a grassroots organization, and we are mass filing what is called a Title III complaint. All complaints that violate the Help America Vote Act. This act was passed in 2002. It was a sweeping reform to the nation's voting process to address voting systems and voter access. Every state has a path for citizens to file these complaints, but the majority of the population is distracted and uninformed. The uninformed are helpless, and they are easier to control. Our goal is to give back the people a voice, a path of recourse, and to educate citizens of the power we have as individuals, and an independent and informed mind is not easy to control. We are at a precipice in the world, the decision to lay down and die or fight back for independence. We should strive to take care of one another while still respecting individualism and to ensure that the free world and democracy does not fall. Thank you for your time and efforts. I appreciate everything you all are doing.
Before the panel answers, I want to bring up another witness from Pennsylvania, Glenn Stenholm, and I believe that his affidavit, and I should say about Leah, that she's one of the people in Pennsylvania that's now organizing what's called the Citizens Commission for Truth in Elections. So if we have Glenn, I understand he has a short period of time to be on. So can we bring him on?
This is Greg Stenstrom. Thank you very much. It's close. It's I appreciate being here, and I appreciate everything that's been said here. I want to say that I think Leah and I share many of the same sentiments and same experience. I was one of the people that Leah recruited, and it's been an awakening. But in listening to earlier to Marino, his statements, and then listen to Bill, those are the 2 people that I keyed in on. I think what we can do as a republic and as citizens, and I think one of the things that Lyndon LaRouche did, is one of what I think is among the first libertarians or modern day libertarians, is what our job is to give other people courage. People like the panelists here, Leah, myself, what I see our job is to give people courage to speak up. As Bill said earlier, the deep state, the career bureaucracy, which is I think largely responsible for where we are today. The only way to fight them is to have individuals speak up. Lyndon took a beating for much of his life, but I remember him growing up, and I remember listening to him speak, and I think that a lot of his, the predictions and things that have come up this morning, which have been fascinating to listen to in context, historical context. I think we just have to give other people courage. That's what I would say. And I'm prepared to answer any questions you might have. I was a witness to tens of thousands of votes, fraudulent votes. I am a forensic expert and a fraud expert, and my testimony has been included in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court cases, the Texas Supreme Court cases, and there'll be other cases forthcoming, and we're still going. The Texas case was rejected by the Supreme Court as a matter of standing. So one of the things that people don't understand in the context of the courts is, as individuals, we don't have a right to free elections as individuals. And there's a reason for that. It sounds outrageous, but I've been educated by some great constitutional lawyers over the last few weeks. And they said, if we had an individual right to free elections, then we'd have 20 million lawsuits at every presidential election. So he said, as a matter of standing in a body of law, the candidates are the ones with standing. In some cases, as in Texas, where the Supreme Court said they lacked standing in one aspect, they gave them a clear path into how they could get standing. I expect Texas to refile. I expect the Wisconsin case to be heard. And there are cases that Leah and I are both working on together, in addition to the Title III HAVA, initiative she's doing, that, we're going to continue going, up to January 19th, January 20th, whatever the outcome is. I do think President Trump will prevail. But whatever the case is, this isn't over. And as in a closing statement, I think that the legacy, it is a privilege to be here with the Schiller Institute. I think the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche is present in all of you and all of us, and that we just have to continue this fight and continue educating the public and continuing to give them courage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Sorry about that. And I just want to say that what we're going to do is take responses from the panel. But before we do that, let me simply state that right after we have this next round of responses, we have a special guest who I see with us, Mr. Joseph McCluskey, former Deputy Prime Minister of the Czech and Slovak Federative Republic, member of the 1995 Martin Luther King Tribunal, which heard many different cases, including the case of Lyndon LaRouche. So we'll be going to Dr. McCluskey just after our panel responds to what was just said. And I'd like to first ask if Dave Meiswinkle has any response to what was just heard from the two persons from Pennsylvania.
Yes, I do. And also with the sentiment of Bill Benny, Bill mentioned the possible need for a third party. That's something to really consider. But I think what we're talking about here is this corrupt voting system, which seems to be obvious. All the incidences that were described, it's almost overwhelming to think of the extent of the corruption and the coordination. But we've seen that, at least in our lifetime, since the John Kennedy situation and up through 9/11. It's almost impossible, it seems, to get a fair hearing anywhere. Seems impossible for courts to take an issue. We've had done litigation down in New York City to try to get a grand jury there based on controlled demolition of those buildings and bombs and explosives with many witnesses. We have people that lost their sons, their husbands, their brothers, firemen, and the courts have told us we don't have standing, which seems to be outrageous. How can people that have lost their loved ones not have standing? But that's the situation right now that, as I said, there's ongoing litigation in New York City in the Southern District. But overall, what it does, I think, is that we've seen some of the players, in particular the media, and how slanted the media is, and how really criminal it is, in the sense of how things are developing. So I think the hope is there, as has been mentioned just now, about the courage to speak the truth and to lead by staying the course. As it was said, this isn't over. What's at stake here, though, is a battle for the Republic, the battle for our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. And again, as the leader of a free world, as we go, the world goes. So everything is at stake now. Our brothers, our sisters, our children, our grandchildren, our dreams. Everything is at stake now.
Thank you. Helga, I just think since you are clearly looking at this from the outside and you haven't had a chance, I think, to talk to any of the Pennsylvania witnesses, if you have anything you'd like to say to them.
Well, I think that, what is clearly posed right now is a situation like the one described in the Declaration of Independence, because, you know, as we know, because of the prosecution of my late husband, and, you know, the Operation Frühmenschen was mentioned, you know, many of the people who have been prosecuted by the FBI, which was this, what this 95 tribunal was all about. I mean, there have been in the United States, and naturally elsewhere in the world as well, for a long time, a great number of people who felt powerless, because if they don't have money, they can't afford a lawyer. Lawyers are very expensive, and, you know, if you can't afford a lawyer, you know, then, you know, you are practically lost. And that feeling that you have no recourse, that is the feeling of lawlessness many people in the world have. Now, if the beacon of hope and former temple of liberty, United States, is losing that characteristics, I can only repeat, it has meaning for the entire world. And therefore, the condition which is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, that, you know, for the stability of the government and so forth, you may be forced to endure a condition, and I'm now paraphrasing it, the Declaration of Independence says it much more beautiful, you may be forced to endure a condition like that for a very long time. But then comes the moment where it becomes intolerable, and then you have to actually stand up and change it. And that is exactly the same idea what Friedrich Schiller describes in the beautiful drama Wilhelm Tell, in the famous Ridley Oath, which is almost identical in terms of the formulation with the Declaration of Independence, where he says, when such a condition arises, you have to reach into the stars and touch those inalienable rights which are hanging there eternally. And I think it has that historic and ontological, almost ontological dimension, that you are touching upon something which, you know, has to do with the laws of the universe and justice, and can humanity continue to exist. So I think you expressed it already very well, but I think it has that dimension, so you should think about it.
All right, I'd just like to know, thank you. Is there anyone else from the panel that would like to respond to the two witnesses? If not, we want to thank you both for what you had to say, not only for what you're saying, but what you're doing. This idea of a Citizens Commission for Truth in Elections that now becomes a permanent mobilization of the American people is essential. And since I'm also originally from Pennsylvania, I certainly have a particular interest in this. We know about Ben Franklin, and we know what he did. And we know that there's something like that that's going to have to be done by us independently. Again, even I'm the moderator, not supposed to editorialize. I thank you very much for
we thank you.
This. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. We'd like to hear now, if we can, from Mr. McCluskey. Do we have him there? We're going to bring him up on this. We'll just give us a moment here. And as we said before, he is the former Deputy Prime Minister of the Czech and Slovak Federative Republic. He was a longtime associate, actually, of Lyndon LaRouche and his cause. Helga mentioned the 1995 Martin Luther King Tribunal, exactly 25 years ago, which heard a series of cases involving the harassment of black elected officials, an FBI operation called Operation Frühmenschen, involving the case of Lyndon LaRouche himself, and other cases that were discussed at great extent at that time. And so Mr. McCluskey knew Lyndon LaRouche very well. He's with us here now. So, Mr. McCluskey, go right ahead. We're happy to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I maybe make also a small remark for this lady about this rehabilitation. I should speak about it in my speech, but in Slovakia, we had in 50s and 60s past century, especially in communistic time, about 70,000 people politically persecuted and given to the jail for altogether more than 100,000 of years. maybe today live from them 1,000 people. But after Velvet Revolution in 1989, all these people were rehabilitated. Not very much financially, but morally, 100%. I think that also in United States must come the time that such a person like Lyndon LaRouche should be full rehabilitated. In my speech, I shall probably more speak about it. And I think that President Trump has just 1 month to make this historical decision. They are brother and sister and friends. I'm from Slovakia, from small town near Bratislava, Svätý Jur, San Giorgio, father of 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 7 grandchildren. I'm old man, and my English not so good. Maybe German or Russian or Italian would be better. But after suggestion of Helga, I should speak English, and I try to do it. Lyndon LaRouche, my old friend, was a politician, economics, mathematician, and musicologist, and 8 times US presidential candidate. I met him 17 times in America, in Slovakia, Germany, and also in Italy 2 times. The first interview lasted 6 hours and took place in a prison in Rochester, United States, where he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. His parole in 1994, after 5 years, I learned probably as a first in the world. He immediately visited Slovakia for the second time in 1996. He was a generator of new ideas. His predictions about the development of the world are fulfilled. I have never met a more educated person in my life. His closest collaborator was his wife Helga, who successfully continues his work in the Schiller Institute. Thank you very much, Helga, for it. I should like to commemorate a little bit also about the collaborators of Lynn movement. Nina Ogden. She was the daughter of Ukraine immigrants, close friend of Saint Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa said her years ago, "We are praying every day for Lynn and Helga." I have a 50-page calendar at the Station of the Cross with the name I Thirst, with personal dedication of Mother Teresa and signature. She gave it to her to Nina before the Cairo conference in 1994, his text against abortion with the right to spread it around the world. Nina was modest, committed to the fight for human rights. During my visit to the United States, we drove together around highways to visit politicians and bishops. In the New York, the Bronx, Bishop Garmendia gave me in this time a 5-kilogram pocket of various rosaries. I brought them home and handed them out on our meeting. Nina died resting in Purcell, and I never forget for her. According to the former Attorney General, my friend Ramsey Clark, Mr. LaRouche case represented a broader range of deliberate cuning and systematic misconduct over a longer period of time, utilizing the power of the federal government than any other prosecution by the US government in my time or to my knowledge. I have been familiar with the case of Lynn for many years. As the deeply Catholic and previous fighter against totality, I am persuaded that Lyndon LaRouche was an extraordinary Renaissance person with many knowledge about various aspects of science, culture, religion, history, and politics. His ideas offer new, non-traditional alternatives for development of the world, United States, and also our post-socialist countries. Therefore, he had so many enemies. He and his collaborators should be exonerated. I was not surprised when its exoneration call, still years ago, to the President Clinton was signed by thousands of prominents from all over the world, also me. I'm not prominent, but I signed it many times, and also by more than 700 state congressmen and legislators from the United States. I met Lyndon LaRouche for the first time in August 1993. He introduced Christian moral principles to politics and economics. He was a fighter for moral renewal and the saving of Christian civilization. I was always surprised about his knowledge about Mozart and Beethoven, about supercomputers, about the situation in Eastern Europe, in Russia and China, and many other countries. Also about the protection of life, protection of culture and education. His speeches left no gray area. Compromise with evil was not possible. Lynn was a hard fighter, but also had humor and tenderness when speaking about love, agape, and God. He was a generator of new ideas and association, which are alternatives for the present world system. I remember that he always has spoken about heavy ideas, but it's another topics, but he was generator of these heavy ideas. His political program was the need to produce, not speculate. Moral principles must be established in politics and also in economy. His proposed alternatives to reform the financial system. He predicted a crisis, especially due to the destructive impact of derivative speculation. This situation is still the same. Fast all countries speculate on the bourse with derivatives and without work make money, and it is non-moral and not good. Printing money with no backing in the United States and Europe today is called quantitative easing. Interest rates are being lowered and money pumped into the old system in area of crisis. Bad banks are being rescued, and the current financial system has been torn away from a productive economy. Last but not least, there President Trump, Donald Trump. Some days ago, I evaluated in some American journal some discussion with me about this election campaign, about results, about future of America. I don't want to speak about it, but I beg you to rehabilitate Lyndon LaRouche. You nominated Christian judges to the Supreme Court, and as the first American president, you were on the March for Life, where you said, every child is a precious and sacred gift from God. You wanted to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. In 4 years, the United States led you did not start any war. At your inauguration, you said, for too long, a group of people in Washington has been in power, thinking only of their own interests. You also said what others did not say. Almighty Creator, the Bible says how good it is for God's people. They live in unity, and you're typically may God bless America. Please rehabilitate Lyndon LaRouche. And on the end, my honor memory for him and pray for his soon rehabilitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCloskey. Thank you very, very much for that. I hope you can stay with us for a bit. We want to go right now to the co-founder of Action for Assange. His name is Andrew Smith, and he has a bit of a schedule problem, so we're going to try to get him in and then get back to our discussion. So go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I just want to start with, I appreciate you guys bringing me on to talk. It's an honor being able to listen to Bill Binney, let alone speak after him at any event. But I don't know much personally about Lyndon, but I assume most of you feel about him the way I feel about Julian Assange, that he is someone that put himself forward to defend principles of justice and democracy and transparency, and had a vision for a world that included everybody, at least from the way that it was described and the what he believed through what you guys had said. But in the very beginning, there was actually a video that you guys played of Lyndon speaking himself. And there was some points in there that I took really, I don't know, like reflective, I guess. And they were the contributions, actions of universal law and principles, willful actions of significance, strategy, fighting to defend progress, original documents of times and events of the church, a vision from the tower, and then that dreadful word that's permeated society for so long, fascism. To kind of frame it in Julian Assange's situation, because Victor did a great job laying out the facts and how everything relates to another. But to kind of circle this back to the points that Lyndon made in that first video, Julian's contribution to the public record and to the world that we live in is yet to even be fully understood. I found out actually, because I've spent the last 76 weeks of my life doing a show in support of Julian, fighting for his freedom, that Cablegate and most of the other pieces of information that he released to us were supposed to be released in different ways. But there was actors and intelligence communities and others that brought that down. Cablegate, for example, was supposed to be rolled out across, I believe, 80 different countries over the course of a year, highlighting different acts of political consequence and corruption for those different cities, working on a local level. And there was one thing that Julian used that supported that more than anything, and it's what he actually called a universal principle or an action of the universe. And that is the idea that it is far easier to encrypt information or to hide information or to put information behind a key than it is to build the key to use to unlock that door. And that was something that Julian had used to great effect to expose the intelligence state and the national security state. And that was through willful acts of significance. I believe it was in a 2017 interview, one of the last ones that he gave, he described his work in WikiLeaks as essentially an icebreaker that, if necessary, will slam into an iceberg to preserve everyone behind them and create a greater vacuum for free speech. And I think that that's a strategy that he used extremely well and is still using, because he literally forced the US in court to say that there is no First Amendment, that the United States gets to determine at the whim of an executive who gets to choose what is and isn't in violation of the Espionage Act. And that's horrifying to me. I'm 29 years old. I was born 10 years before 9/11 happened. And that was one of the things that kind of built this whole world view that I have, that humans are fundamentally good. There are just a few bad people, and all we have to do is reach people where they're at with the right information to change them. And that, to me, comes down to LaRouche's point about strategy. And the thing for the last 76 weeks that we've been encouraging people is simply do what you can with the time and money and resources that you have. It doesn't have to be massive protests that change the world. There was literally a guy in US history we talk about by the name of Paul Revere that ran down the street on a horse yelling the British are coming, right? I'm here in DC. I drove the last 9 hours, well, last night, 9 hours to make it here. And personally, I'm not a Donald Trump supporter. I'm not a Joe Biden supporter. I believe people should vote for themselves and act in a way that they want the world to act towards them. But defending democracy is a basic institution. And I've lived my entire life not actually knowing what that word means, just being told what it represents. And now I'm literally, I don't know, on a city block away from anti-fascists actively attacking people, asking for an open democratic process. So I don't have the vision from the tower that LaRouche had talked about. I don't have the ability to see the events playing out on a grand scale, aside from what I've been able to teach myself and learn over the last 29 years of my existence. But one thing I do know is that fascism is two things: the merger of corporate and political power and the desire to deny people a right to exist based on ideologies. And Julian was a big supporter of post-partisanism. He actually went as far as to say every political ideology is bankrupt. And it's not because there's anything wrong with ideologies, but because we all lack such a basic access to information to even understand what's happening, to take teams for ideologies to even form from it. So I just hope that we can see and reach a place where it's not capitalism, socialism, communism, where it's Andrew and Bill and Suzanne and people just living for the benefit of each other in a system that allows them to do so. Because right now we're probably 6 months away maybe from grocery store clerks calling the police because you didn't have your right card from your government. And I don't have an answer, but all I can say at this point is if we do nothing, we're dead. So I appreciate you allowing me use of your platform and to even just listen to this, because it's been enlightening to me.
Well, Andrew, stay right there, because I am certain that you're going to get some responses from the panel at this point. And we also want to sort of open things, expand a little bit to have more of a little bit of a dialogue. So let me just ask, does anybody want to either say anything in response to Andrew or otherwise? Okay, Harley's got his hand up. We'll go with him first.
Yeah, I think this is quite important in the context of what Andrew just said and what Bill Binney said earlier. There was an executive order, Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, to protect whistleblowers. And this is highly relevant for what's being discussed. Now, what it says is, in no case shall information be classified, continue to be maintained as classified, or fail to be declassified to conceal violations of law. And there are a couple of other points under that. But essentially what it says is that whistleblowers should be protected to the extent they're exposing criminal activity. And this is what was done in the case of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, the exposure of war crimes that were committed based on lies from intelligence agencies. And we've seen this repeated with Russiagate, the lies that were used to get the FISA warrants to spy on the president. We're seeing it again with the censorship of the investigation into the election. So I think this is an important point that has to be brought out in this question of the full disclosure of classified information to the extent it's being used to cover up crimes. The point of this executive order was to stop that. And I think that's something that's more needed at this exact moment than ever. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thanks a lot. Anybody else have anything? And I guess I should say, hold on, Dr. McCloskey, if you're speaking, you want to unmute.
Only two sentences. Julian Assange is very well known also in Slovakia. I wrote about him 2 blogs and various articles in favor of his activity. I think that maybe when he should do these things in communism's time, then maybe the Berlin Wall would be fallen 10 years before, as 98, because I think he was very important person, and thank you very much for his activity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, Helga?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that, I want to appeal to everybody who is watching this program to give support to the appeal to President Trump that he should personally guarantee the life and safety of Assange and bring him to the United States, because I think every moment his life is in danger. In Belmarsh, there is COVID-19. I heard that the prisoners are not being separated from the people who are tested positive. So there is an immediate urgency. And I think people should also take this case as a demonstration of what is the role of the British and the absolute double standard and duplicity of the mainstream media. Because if you think how they treated Navalny, who was which is a very dubious case in terms of, what actually contributed. And I think President Putin has pointed out to the fact that Russia would hardly have given him the right to leave, that is Navalny, to Germany, to the Charité hospital to be treated if there was anything to be hidden, and that the whole circumstances of the so-called poisoning are extremely questionable. And, I think there again, the role of the British, the involvement of this British lab, which was also involved in the Skripal case. Anyway, I'm just saying it, the double standard, how Assange is being treated and the Navalny case is something to really discredit all of the operations run against Assange. But I really want to appeal to people to mobilize, because it is a life and death question, extremely urgent.
All right, very good. So we're going to thank you very much, Andrew. We are actually going to be playing a little bit later a video that we have, again, on the Assange case. But I also am told that we have 2 more witnesses on from Pennsylvania, which is good. Olivia Jane Winters and Kim Pedersen. They were both they're poll monitors from the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh areas, respectively. And Olivia was a witness at the Pennsylvania Senate Majority Policy Committee hearing on election issues. So that we've got Olivia up on the screen. That's you? Hello? Please speak and unmute.
Sorry, I was muted.
We wanted to let your voice be heard. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much
no
for
los
having
escuchaba. Muchas gracias por tenerme.
Hold on.
Un segundito.
I'm
Dennis,
sorry,
we're hearing
there's
your
a lag
translation.
time.
Hold on. Okay.
Muy bien.
No, we're still hearing you, Dennis.
Okay, we'll go to another interpreter.
No, okay. All right. Olivia, try again. Let's see if our technical problem's
Okay.
solved.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me in this conference. I feel very honored to be a part of it. Just a little background about myself. My name is Olivia Jane Winters. I'm a professional organizer and a business management consultant, and I live in Philadelphia. I actually served as a minority inspector during the presidential election. I'm actually a registered Democrat because in PA, you have to register with a party in order to vote in primary elections. But I actually really recognize myself individually as a nonpartisan person. I had committed to working the polls to ensure that the election was going to be fair and honest. For those of you who don't know, a minority inspector essentially represents the minority party in your district. So I was representing the Republican Party. I just really feel that we should all as Americans and citizens of the world care about fair and honest elections. If we don't have those basic principles of truth and righteousness, then what do we really have? So I actually had testified, as you mentioned before, in the PA Senate hearing that was held in Gettysburg a couple of weeks ago. And really just a summation of what had happened. I just faced a lot of hatred at the polls. I was attacked for calling out essentially election fraud, electioneering, people who were voting very illegally. I was silenced in the polls. I was told to shut up. I was told to be quiet. I was told to let it happen. I was told that I was going to get punched in the face or slapped in the face. I'm sorry. It got out of hand. It was not a situation in which I felt that democracy was apparent. It was corruption. It was blatant corruption. So I think at this point in time, it's really made me think about what's happening in our country. I really think that we need to protect our basic principles and our future from corruption in the deep state. And I think it's really important that we should be asking questions right now, especially, for those people who are doubting what's happening, are doubting the legitimacy of these claims of election fraud, are doubting corruption in the deep state, are doubting that there are greater forces at play here. We really need to be looking to the truth tellers in society who are being attacked, who are being imprisoned, who are being silenced. People like Navalny, people like Assange, people like Trump, people like LaRouche, and then down to individuals like us. If we don't do that, then we're really giving in to this idea of fascism, in my opinion.
Okay. Okay, very good. Thank you. And now we're just going to go to Kim Pedersen, poll monitor from the Pittsburgh area, and we'll then be going to our panel for their observations. I know we'll certainly have them from our attorneys. So, hi, Kim. Can you hear us? Great.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am also very honored to be a part of this. I think it is very important what we're all doing here today, just for the future of our country and our children. I will tell you a little bit about myself. My husband and I are small business owners. We have about 15 employees, and I am a stay-at-home mom / bookkeeper for our company. So, I am just a basic, I'm not an expert on anything when it comes to many of the people on the panel here, but I'm just an American citizen, and I feel it is very important that I speak up as to what I experienced during this election. First of all, I decided to get involved in the election months ago because I knew it was very important to this country. For decades, obviously, we've been seeing a lot of changes in our country when it comes to politics and where we were headed. And it really scared me and has scared me for a long time. So I decided to get involved, and I volunteered to be a poll watcher, or actually at the place where they open the mail-in ballots. And on election day was scheduled to be there for 4 or 5 hours and at a warehouse in Allegheny County in downtown Pittsburgh. And I didn't know what to expect when I got there, but when I was led back to where the mail ballots were being opened, we were kept, I was very surprised actually to see that we were kept in corrals 25 to 100 feet away from viewing any kind of opening of ballots. And, we were given a small training the day before, video of what we're supposed to look for and what we're supposed to do while we're there. And none of those things were even available to be, nothing was able to be done because we were so far from seeing anything or witnessing anything. And it was very discouraging. I was very confused and didn't understand, how that was the way it was supposed to be. So I only stayed for probably an hour and a half. I did take a picture with my phone just because I figured this doesn't seem right to me. Little did I know at the time that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had just changed many of the rules of the election within weeks before Election Day. And this was one of the rules that they changed, that we were to be kept far away from the opening of the mail-in ballots and corralled into a certain area. So that was very discouraging because I do believe that Pennsylvania is pivotal to this country as far as being the state that we are and being the swing state that we are. We do carry a lot of weight in elections, and our Supreme Court and the governors and the people that rule our state are involving themselves in the elections, which shouldn't be done. I believe that we do have to continue to fight this, and that is why I'm here today. I want to be a part of however I can to help this country be what it is supposed to be, the free country that we all know it to be, and that why people flock to want to live in this country. So I really, again, appreciate that I was able to speak here today, and I guess that's all I have. Thanks so much.
Thank you. What we're going to do is get a couple of responses, at least from our panel. And I'd like to ask first from the attorneys. So Dave, if you have anything to say to Olivia and to Kim.
Yes, I think from the Pennsylvania experience, and I have roots in Pennsylvania too. I was born there and lived there for a long time. So I know the heritage and the pride that many Pennsylvania people have. But the corruption that seemed to be systematic and organized, where we're talking about the law is being violated. Unfortunately, we're talking about judges that are political appointments and that don't have the courage that was stressed before. So this gives us an opportunity, though, because our nation's been slipping for quite a while. And I won't say we've hit the bottom. We have not hit the bottom, but we've seen the corruption. The system is corrupt through and through, and maybe from top to bottom. And we've seen our media is totally corrupt. It seems that way. And the internet platforms seem to be totally corrupt and misleading, and were used in the political vein the entire time. So as far as going back to the poll workers, where they have to deal with the hostility, which is it seems to be characteristic of this election and others too, but especially this election. And in particular, when you're not allowed to view ballots. Now, absentee ballots or mail-in ballots. I had an experience changing a primary election at one time because we were able to get the envelopes and compare them with signatures, and it was a close election, and bring an expert in from New York who confirmed what the suspicion was that there was fraud involved, and when the people were subpoenaed one by one, the votes were disregarded, and we were able to overturn the election. Now, that's what we'd like to do here in some ways, right? Overturn what has happened, not because you're one political persuasion, but because you want to know the truth. And the truth seems to be, in every way, to be covered up or prevented or obstructed. It seems that the truth has been hijacked for a long time in the United States. So with the various people that have spoken here, the poll workers, that gives a lot of hope. I mean, that they're honored to be on with us, but we're honored to be on with them, because really they're the grassroots people that work in this election. They see firsthand. They're excellent witnesses. Hopefully someday they may be called into court, and hopefully someday that may be weighed properly by a judge and by a jury or whoever is going to be here and consider it, and we can see the other side. Right now, for most part, the people are just seeing one side, but more and more people are waking up. And that's the really optimistic thing. So people may be down, but we're not out. And if we have that heritage to fight back, and eventually we will succeed. The United States so much is pivotal on what we do. So apparently that's probably why a lot of us right now we're here. It's important to be here.
Thanks a lot. Let's just get one other response, if we can. Mr. McCloskey, go ahead.
Thank you. I think that direct election, like in United States, are not very good for this country. And 51% majority must not mean always truth. Fate of the world cannot depend on result of one election with possible fraud or swindle. I think that we must speak about other methods of democracy, because this which is now here is not good. And last, greeting to Pittsburgh. I think that this lady was from Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is the biggest Slovak country in the world, town in the world. Many million people with Slovak origin was this Allegheny country. I was there as a mathematician on Carnegie Mellon University. I therefore remember very much this country, also Slovak there. And our biggest poet also lived there. And after death, his rest was taken to the Slovakia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So what we're going to do is we have a bit of a time constraint, although we want to keep you all there. We just won't be able to see everybody on the screen at the same time. And I wanted to say, we want to make sure that Professor El Salviv is integrated in, so we're trying to change our technical situation a bit so we can actually get him in. But let's do the following. I'd like to just take a moment. The witnesses, you'll still be there. You may not be seen on screen. And Harley, did you have something you wanted to say, or you just paused there, pensive?
No,
why don't you go, and then we'll go back. All right.
I just want to bring people back to the bigger picture, because these witnesses' testimony is absolutely crucial. But I think it has to be framed by what we'll be discussing in the second panel, the strategic situation. What we have been saying is that there was a coup underway in the United States for 4 years. And what we've seen since the media proclaimed Biden the president-elect is the pulling together of a cabinet, which is a war cabinet, which goes beyond what Obama was doing and what Bush were doing. in terms of bringing in the war party, the military-industrial complex, to carry out attacks on other nations. This is what Biden has always supported. And when we talk about a coup, we're talking about a radical reversal of policy. In a sense, what Trump in his election did was try to break from the old Bush-Obama policies, the geopolitical confrontations. And since the proclamation that Biden won by the Associated Press, they've pulled together a war cabinet and an economic team that's committed to this global reset. So when we're having this discussion, including the importance of a fair vote, I think it's just worth noting that the testimony is really crucial because it's part of putting together this picture of defending the true interests of the American people from a group of coup plotters and color revolutionaries who are trying to put the United States back fully with the imperial tradition of geopolitics, which means more killing, more war, and less peace and security. So I just wanted to make that point.
Okay, thanks a lot, Harley. What we're going to do is this. We're going to Diane, who has a few written questions, and then let's hear those first, and then we'll proceed. Diane?
Okay, so I'm choosing 4 of these, and I'll just read them all and suggest who might answer them. Other people may have things, and some of them are rather heavy, but I think really belong on this panel because we have to develop an approach to thinking about this that allows us to solve it. So the first question, which may be for Harley and also David Meiswinkle, comes from Mexico. 1, what are the real options that Trump and his team now have to keep the presidency in the face of the fraud and the refusal of the Supreme Court to review the demands of Texas and the other states? Yes, and then secondly, and there was another question about what's happening with Georgia and is there something still live in Georgia as far as a lawsuit? Secondly, if Biden and Harris end up being inaugurated, is there any alternative that can prevent thermonuclear war? The second question, which I think is important because I was also monitoring the YouTube channel during this, and there's a lot on this question of martial law, which Harley, or I don't know if Bill Binney is still on, others may want to answer. Someone writes, there seems to be a dangerous willingness coming from certain corners in the United States that the president suspend the Constitution and implement martial law in order to restore the integrity of the election. Could you please address this issue? And if we are not to use martial law, what other constitutional measures can be utilized? There is a question to Dave Christie. The third question, please expand on what you said to include the Josiah Macy Foundation cybernetics study, which lasted 12 years, and what Lyndon LaRouche's reaction to their trickery has meant for modern history. And then finally, for Helga, which is a tough one, which will be taken up throughout the conference, but I think very appropriate, from Carolina in Mexico. I want to ask you about Schiller's aesthetical letters. Is it right to think that his letters are full of apparently unresolvable paradoxes, yet Schiller resolves them at a higher level? For example, beauty as the resolution of the contradiction between thought and emotion. Is there a relationship of this to Cusa's coincidence of opposites?
So let me just review, Diane. So we have a question for Harley and for Dave Meiswinkle. I heard Helga, and when was there one for another person? Didn't hear.
Oh, you know, I actually had one that I wanted to ask to Mr. El-Savif.
Okay, so you want to...
Sorry, can I just say that?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Here's from a young person in Kinshasa. We now hear about allegations of vote fraud during the recent presidential election in America. Vote fraud, that is what we are familiar with here in Africa. America is the most powerful nation on earth. the biggest democracy in the world. Yet how can it now help African countries, otherwise known as whole countries, redress their failures, especially with regard to corruption and vote fraud?
Okay, so here's what I want to do. We've got about 15 minutes in which we can take these questions. So I'm going to ask that we go to Harley and Dave first, to Dr. El-Saviv next, and can we please make sure on the translation side we keep that tight, and then we go to Helga. Okay, so Harley, you want to start, and then Dave pick up?
All right, on the two questions, the Trump options and the question of martial law, there are some legal options. You can refile some of these cases. There are still cases that are alive and still moving ahead. There's still an investigation underway, but I think this is why we have to go outside of the existing judicial process, because we've seen that the courts are completely dominated by the fear of stepping outside of the accepted view of the establishment. The justices have proven to be cowardly in the face of this, just adopting the media line. So what options do you have? Well, what I laid out earlier, the full declassification to show what the deep state or the military industrial complex is committed to in controlling the process. Look, a lot of this has already come out over the last few years, but put it all in one package and get it out. Secondly, a special prosecutor that has the ability to file criminal charges, because vote fraud in many cases is a felony. And so I think these are real options that exist that are there for the Trump legal team. As far as the talk about martial law, this is completely unacceptable. You know, you defend the Constitution by suspending the Constitution. You know, the remedies exist within constitutional practices. What's most important is the mobilization to activate a majority of the population to defend the historic traditions of our nation. And the idea that we're somehow going to call in the military, that's what Colonel Black was saying the other side was planning to do to remove President Trump. So I think we have to use all legal remedies, including demonstrations, mobilizations, and additional legal cases. But it's very dangerous to open this can of worms about martial law right now.
Okay, very good. Dave, you have anything, or is that enough?
Yeah, Harley, he covered a lot of it, but just to say that the historical context, I don't think we've been in this situation. I mean, we were really pressed against the wall. I heard somebody sent me a link last night. Cynthia Johnson, the Detroit congresswoman, who was threatening Trump supporters and calling on the soldiers to take care of them and saying, you know what to do. I know from being a retired police officer, talking to people, that throughout the country, the ammunition is being bought up all over the place. So this to put it in a real context, this is, both sides are gearing up. Pray to God that doesn't happen, anything violent. We haven't seen that. We've seen it in some of the cities flare up, isolated. But we are at a crucial time. We're dealing with a system that is innately corrupt, unfortunately. But we're asking the laws to remedy the situation. We ask the FBI, which seems to be innately corrupt, to investigate crimes. We've seen what they did with regards to the president when he came in 2016. We've seen what the intelligence agencies are capable of. We've seen that those in power, as mentioned before, the bureaucrats, more or less, run the show to a large extent. From president to president, the same type people are there. The system is the same. The system is pushing now like they've never done before. They have an agenda too. And they have a script. And they're following their script as best they can. Apparently, this president fouled up the script a little bit. And they try to foul him up. That's given us a time to reflect and to think about important issues like our democracy and like our freedom, and like putting together something that can captivate the imagination of people and take us out of this mess. I don't want to be pessimistic, and I'd like to be optimistic to say that this is a hopeful situation because so many people were unaware that this nation has been held captive for quite a while. And if this awareness bubbles to the surface, we'll be in a lot better shape than actually we were 4 years ago. We'll be in better shape. We know what the problems are, some of them. One of them is the media right away. We know that they distort everything that's put out there, and they're just an extension of the so-called oligarchs going all the way back at the highest level that allows the agenda to be carried out. So, again, to be optimistic, we're here. There's a lot of things that have to be done. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled in Texas, not favorably. Though if the standing question is something that was of importance, if it's refiled, perhaps that would hold up, But I don't know what, of course, none of us know what's going through President Trump's mind now. He's reviewing these options. But again, we're in a historic time. We expect that this will be handled and somehow it's going to be resolved and everything will be nice tomorrow in some way. And I think, to be honest, we don't know what's going to happen. And Trump is a wild card. So this is a historic time. We don't know. And we just pray for the best.
Okay, thanks a lot. I understand. I hold on, Dr. McCluskey. Dave Christie, I think there was a question for you also, so we're going to let you take a minute, but we have to be very quick. We have basically about 10 minutes left. We're going to go from you to Dr. El-Saviv, and then we're going to go to Helga. Okay? So Dave, go ahead.
All right, well, it's tough to be brief on this one, given that effectively the answer is the LaRouche-Riemann method, that Lynn developed that concept of his, the foundation of his economic theory in reaction to Norbert Wiener and the cybernetics grouping. And just, briefly, they essentially viewed the world in this digital construct of just simply that the human condition is that of a stimulus response, which is a lot of the things that the cybernetics group was looking at. And, for humanity, living in that as an economic system, that's effectively a kind of an ecological approach, or what the modern day environmentalists would view. Whereas Lynn, what he developed with the LaRouche-Riemann method is that you're always seeking to go to the next economic platform, that the animal-like existence of ecology, of simply an existing resource base, is that it's the mode of hypothesis and the generation of new ideas to hypothesize where the next platform that you need to actually develop through scientific and technological innovation, and that is the very, the ability to do that is the creative process itself, which I think Helga laid out with this coincidence of opposites approach by Cusa, is that you've got to have that view of the creator, the created, and the act of creation all as a simultaneous unity, and that does not exist in a simple stimulus response system. So maybe I'll just leave it there, but I think that that's the core of the refutation of this whole digital conception, is the act of creation. And to get a sense of the LaRouche-Riemann method, you're going to have to read a lot of Lynn. So I encourage everybody to do that.
All right, I understand that we're having a technical problem with Dr. El-Saviv's connection. What we're going to do is show a video we had on Julian Assange from one of the activists in his cause down in New Zealand, I believe that was. And her name was Alex Hills. So we're going to show that, and then we're going to come back for Helga's answer, and we'll be summarizing at that point.
The torture and persecution of Julian Assange is a global attack on our free press. The case of the century is being heard by a military complex entwined judge. It's the death penalty for free speech. I speak as a British Australian as well as a Kiwi, but none of these countries have lifted a finger to save Assange. Even the country that produced this award-winning journalist, Australia, has hung him out to dry. Five Eyes countries specifically have conspired to block and censor information on the trial, and any politicians or media who have spoken out have been deplatformed, removed, mocked, and harassed. It took thousands of years and the rise and fall of several civilizations to gain our human rights and free press. And our rogue imperialist governments are unraveling that in the space of a couple of years. We can't let it happen on our watch. Britain, home of the Magna Carta, now reduced to murdering a publisher through legal process. Here in New Zealand, Nikki Hager not only gave evidence in Julian's trial as one of the journalists that redacted names in WikiLeaks documents, but he also worked with Serena Tenari in Switzerland to produce an open letter in support of Assange, signed by 1,600 professional journalists, including Pilger, Hedges, Chomsky, Ellsberg. But our media remains completely silent. Free Assange New Zealand tabled an emergency petition for Julian's asylum here in New Zealand in 2018. The Select Committee responded that they had no jurisdiction. Incredible. A sovereign country. We've attempted to use candle displays, theatrics, rogue speeches, music to help inform the public. And we've found that by adding these creative endeavours to our actions for Julian, it has made it much harder for the establishment to smear and co-opt the movement, like so often happens with genuine movements. This helped us build enough of a platform that last year on Julian's birthday, Wellington invited the world to join us for a free press vigil, and a whopping 62 cities took part. As with our other Kiwi efforts, we got crickets from the legacy New Zealand media. Rubbing salt into the wound, when I rang Radio New Zealand to beg them to cover this global action, the news desk asked me to spell Assange. And then finally, when I did get through to a reporter, she told me that this feel-good Kiwi story was not newsworthy. It was old news. This was while the protests were still rolling out around the world. Despite this disgusting apathy and complicity from the world's media, I have noticed a sea change in how the public are receiving our actions. In 2018, it wasn't uncommon for a military person or a Hillary fan or feminist to lash out at free press activists. But now this has become a thing of the past. In order to redress the gross imbalance in this world right now, normal, everyday people like you need to stand up. You need to completely reject legacy media and stand up for journalists and whistleblowers. Things like Tulsi's legislation that's going through in America right now. Most importantly, we need to remove these corrupted war criminals from their positions of power on the left and the right. I think we all know too well that this is a bipartisan problem. So this isn't just about Julian Assange. This is about our children's access to information, our very right for free press, which is disappearing before our eyes along with our human rights. If you want to get involved, Candles for Assange are listing protests all around the world right now. There is up to 40 events over the next month leading up to the extradition trial decision day, which is 4th of January. And for that day, we want to try and get as many cities listed as possible doing actions. Some of these may be online actions, as I know that there are places that are locked down. Action for Assange channel, which is also with Slow News Day, are covering all these protests. And if anyone needs help broadcasting this, I understand that they'll be helping anyone that wants to get their online protests broadcast. Candles for Assange are on Twitter and Facebook, and if you're in New Zealand, Free Assange New Zealand is the group that are doing actions in Auckland and Wellington regularly. Thank you for having me, Harley.
Okay, a little plug for Harley Schlanger there, but now I think we've solved our technical problems. So Professor El Salviv, we're going to you. Please be short. We're a little bit of time left here, and that'll be your closing remark. And then Helga, we're going to then go to you. Hear us? All right, we're not able to hear you.
En cuanto a la pregunta que formuló el participante,
With
es
regard to the
importante establecer el papel de la Administración Federal.
With regard to the question that was asked by the person, it's very important to know what the role is, the proper role of the federal electoral authorities.
En ese sentido, la privatización a que ha sido sometida las elecciones norteamericanas y los derechos electorales norteamericanos
In that regard, the privatization of the elections which have occurred in the United States and the privatization of the rights of voters in the United States
deben ser investigados y garantizar al pueblo norteamericano unas elecciones limpias, como en los tiempos del presidente Carter, visitaba a los pueblos latinoamericanos para garantizar las elecciones.
And this type of investigation has to be carried out to guarantee to people that there be free elections, just as occurred in the times of Jimmy Carter when he would visit countries in Latin America and elsewhere in defense of free elections.
Para garantizarle a los pueblos latinoamericanos que las elecciones fueran limpias y sin trampas en los pueblos hispanoamericanos y también del África.
And that the elections in Latin America would be carried out in a clean fashion, and that the same thing would have to happen as well in countries of Africa.
Estas elecciones son y constituyen una gran crisis, pero también son una oportunidad para los norteamericanos exigir mayor transparencia en las votaciones norteamericanas.
So these elections are both a big crisis and a big opportunity at the same time for Americans to demand transparency and freedom in these elections. And I hope that I've been able to answer your question satisfactorily. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Helga, hopefully you can still remember the question. And so you're giving the answer, and this is going to basically also be concluding the panel. So wanted to give you that opportunity now.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Carolina, because I think this is a very beautiful question, and what people may not immediately realize, it is extremely relevant to the question discussed at this panel, because it's not just the question of free election, but it is very much the question of inner freedom. And Friedrich Schiller was extremely concerned. He's called the poet of freedom because he put so much emphasis on the question of how to set people free internally, to make them truly free. And that was what really also Nikolaus of Cusa tried to do. And, you know, in one sense, it's not a coincidence that I like these two thinkers maybe better than all the other many beautiful thinkers, because they express exactly that quality of making people really free. As you correctly note, the question of beauty, as it is discussed in Schiller's aesthetical letters and other writings, beauty is the one thing which both relates to the senses, because you have to, you judge beauty by your senses, but it is also a notion born out of reason. And therefore it consoles the two areas which sometimes seem to be unbridgeable, and elevates, you know, the emotion eventually to such a level that everybody can become a beautiful soul which Schiller says, you can educate your emotions in such a way that you blindly can follow them, because they will never tell you anything different than what reason commands. And once you have reached that, then you are a beautiful soul for whom freedom and necessity, passion and duty are one. And Nikolaus, he discusses it in other terms, because obviously he was a couple of centuries earlier. But he, in developing the method of the coincidence of opposites, does in a certain sense the same thing, because his entire method is to prevent the mind from following the habit of latching on to sense certainty, by making it intellectually impossible for the mind to stick to sense certainty by this idea of the coincidence of opposites, and that way training the mind not to be guided by the senses, and therefore be free of manipulation and be able to arrive at the level of reason. So I'm very thankful for your question, because I think the studying of both Schiller and Cusa is extremely important exactly in this moment, because there is so much brainwashing, as Dave was developing, so much effort to manipulate people, that one of the most important questions is, how can we set people free internally? Because it can only come from you. It can only come from this inner strength, which enables you to differentiate what is the truth and what not. So I think this is a very, very good question you asked.
All right. So I want to thank all of the panelists, Dave Meiswinkle, Dave Christie, Harley Schlanger, Marino El Saviv, Dave Meiswinkle, my co-host, I'm looking at everybody, Diane Sayre, Dr. McCloskey, Bill Binney, the various witnesses that we had, Leah Hoops, Greg Stenholm, Olivia Winters, and Kim Pedersen. Is that right? Did I get that right? All right, I think I got everybody. So I want to thank you all for being with us. And we'll be going to our second panel, which will be starting at 1 p.m., they're telling me. So be back for that. That's called Escaping the Danger of World War III, a Strategic Order Based on the Common Aims of Mankind. That will be moderated by Jason Ross, the science advisor for the Schiller Institute. So see us back here at 1 p.m.